Our story begins in the city of Shanxi, in Jinyang County. We are at Change's medical clinic, and someone calls an elder, saying that his tumor had grown. And at that time, did people already know what a tumor was? How modern? The doctor asks how his pain is currently, and he replies that it has worsened, but he can still bear it. Drinking a cup of what I assume is tea, the old man simply asks the doctor to be honest with him, how much time he has left to live. He doesn't even bother looking at the doctor, and keeps staring at his tea. With a sad expression, the doctor explains that although his chi is currently protecting his blood vessels, soon the pain will drive him insane, and one day soon, he will not be able to wake up. The old man places his now empty teacup on the table. Outside the clinic, the old man says he feels there's no longer a need for treatment, and thanks Dr. Suk for everything he has done for him so far. As he leaves, the elder suggests the doctor visit the Liu family for a meal someday while he is still alive. The doctor feels sorrowful, watching as the man walks away, seemingly accepting his fate. He only wished for elder Liu Jinshan to take care of himself. He bows respectfully as the old man walks away. Jinshan walked among pink trumpet trees, observing the falling leaves and thinking he should start settling his affairs before departing. Everything he had built in his life, his family, the Liu family, this treasure that was his family, needed to be carried on by his son and grandchildren. The man had no regrets. However, it was a pity he wouldn't see his youngest granddaughter, Seol, grow up, a special child with a healthy and immortal constitution, a talent that would undoubtedly bring glory to the Liu family when she grew up. Arriving at the gates of his house, they opened to let him in, and something strange caught the elder's attention as he approached the gate. It was as if something bad was about to happen. The old man sensed it, smelled blood, and ran inside his palace. People were there, wondering what had happened, especially now that the patriarch was absent. Pushing through the crowd, he asked them to step aside so he could see what was happening. His eyes widened, seeing that a massacre had occurred in his home, many people lying in eternal sleep before his eyes. Wherever his eyes turned, people were lying forever, unable to rise because they were no longer among the living. Calling out the names of his family members and growing desperate, the old man asked himself what had happened there. Approaching his daughter-in-law, he begged her to open her eyes. Jinshan knelt in despair, faced with the sight of all his family members murdered, including his granddaughter. Who could have done something so heinous? Tears began streaming down his face as he thought about how he had lost everything he had in life. It was too horrible. The Liu family didn't even have enemies, so why would anyone do this to them? Someone called out, noticing the old man placing a knife to his own neck, crying and trembling with despair and sorrow, pleading for someone to stop him. Two men ran toward the old man, asking who would avenge his family if he joined them in death. Hearing these words, he thought about how he could avenge his family with this old and sick body. It was utterly meaningless in his view, and he preferred to take his life now and join his loved ones. The knife was about to pierce his neck when he heard a strange sound. It sounded like crying, and he was trying to figure out where it was coming from until he opened the lid of a small barrel, finding a baby crying desperately inside. The old man recognized his granddaughter, Seol, and crying, hurried to hold her in his arms. She was still alive. Running back inside his house, he began to think about who could have done this and remembered some people who wanted to eradicate his family. They would return. Relieved, others commented on the youngest granddaughter still being alive, assuming the younger daughter-in-law must have hidden her before the attack began. The old man emerged from the house, with a spear in hand, shouting to everyone, saying he had a favor to ask. He needed help burying his family but had to leave now. Saying that everyone there was a witness, he swore to the heavens that before dying, he would avenge all those who committed that crime against his family. His children, his daughters-in-law, his grandchildren. He deeply lamented and apologized for not being there to protect them. In the middle of the forest, the old man ran with his granddaughter on his back. It had been decades since he last used his lightning body techniques, and because of that, every inch of his body was screaming in pain. Nevertheless, survival was paramount in this situation. A blade was just centimeters away from piercing his head, when the old man managed to dodge at the very last second of this stealthy attack. He had his granddaughter on his back, so every movement had to be extremely cautious, and this was an ambush. The ninja's foot went up, and a blade appeared in his shoe, which descended in an attempt to strike the old man, who dodged again with a somersault. The enemy's movements were very simple, so it was possible to handle him quickly, especially since he still had a long way ahead. The old man's kick was just centimeters away from crashing into the enemy's face, when a strange sound occurred, and we saw that the ninja was in a defensive position but hadn't been struck. Jinshan was lying on the ground, trembling, which confused the enemy. The sound in question came from his back cracking. His body could no longer withstand the same level of martial arts as before. It was frustrating. If he were 10 years younger, this ninja would already be in eternal slumber, but he didn't have time to complain. Seol's safety was the priority. things would get dangerous quickly if the enemy's reinforcements arrived. The old man started running again with the little girl on his back, but the ninja began chasing him. The old man's body was already crying for help, and he started shouting at the enemy, asking if he had no compassion. Attacking a newborn and an old man was too despicable for him. A blade grazed the old man's chest, and he realized that words wouldn't suffice. He wouldn't convince the enemy that way. Naruto would be sad about this. He was in a very disadvantageous position. Continuing to run away would only leave him more vulnerable, so he had just one option. If he didn't get rid of that bastard now, the ones who would suffer, in the end, would be him and the girl. The man advanced to eliminate them both at once, and now it was time to use this single chance. The old man grabbed his spear, aiming at the enemy, but the enemy noticed the movement, and leaped upward to avoid the attack. Jinshan thought he could catch him now. He took a deep breath, and used a technique called Lion's Roar. The technique hit the ninja squarely, making him drop his swords, and Jinshan took advantage of the opportunity window to use his true spear technique. The first move, Supreme Flash Pursuit. The spear pierced through the enemy, hurling him backward and slamming him into a tree with immense force. Exhausted, the elder placed his hands on his knees to support his body weight. Approaching the ninja, who was pinned to the tree, defeated, he slapped the man's face, saying he had warned him to stop chasing him. He was a very rude bastard. The man's mask fell to the ground, and the old man looked down and then back at him. As expected, he couldn't recognize the man's face, but he needed to find out who was behind this, even if the man resisted interrogation. He saw a dragon tattoo on the man's neck and said that this was the only piece of information he could extract from him. Seol started crying again, and the old man began to calm her down. What surprised me was that she only started crying now. Jinshan said he would protect her at all costs, and the little girl gave a beautiful smile to the old man. Night fell, and we were at the peak of a mountain, with the old man cooking something for his granddaughter. She must have been very hungry, so he was making something like porridge to feed her. Even though he had brought some milk and other supplies from a nearby village near his home, he had never imagined his final years would be like this. He handed the bowl to the little girl and said that now that it had been boiled, the milk was safe to drink. Drinking the milk eagerly, the old man praised her for doing a good job. What a clever girl, so young and already able to drink raw milk. After finishing the meal, Seol licked her lips in satisfaction. Her belly was full. Proud, Jinshan thought there was no other way. He would do everything he could to protect his granddaughter, and even play with her a little. When the veins on his temple begin to burst, an immense pain takes over his head. The bowl of milk falls as he screams in pain, because the tumor began to attack so strongly that he felt a headache like never before. Tortured by the tumor, the old man screams, kneeling in despair before his granddaughter. He starts to remember the doctor's words, saying that the pain in his mind would become so unbearable that he would lose his sanity until he could no longer wake up. Seol begins crawling toward her grandfather, crying, and the old man says that it wasn't time yet. His memories flash back to a moment when the doctor handed him something to use as a last resort. It wasn't medicine. In fact, it was a poison called the nerve suppression pill. It could extend his life. The doctor had said that, just in case, he should carry that poison with him to use in an emergency. And the moment had come. Starting to lose his sanity, he reaches into his robes. He already knew this poison. It was a drug used to torture prisoners, causing extreme pain without necessarily killing them. Anyone would feel insane pain from this drug. However, if he didn't use this pill now to suppress the tumor, he would end up losing his life there, and everything he had done to protect Seol would be in vain. The pain was absurd, and Seol cried in fear at seeing her grandfather in such a state. Even without understanding, any baby would be frightened by such a scene. Refusing to die, the old man grabs the pill and moves it toward his mouth, saying that his story wouldn't end there. He wouldn't leave Seol alone. The pill goes down his throat, and the pain from the poison was intense, but he didn't care. This mere cheap poison wouldn't take his life. All his veins start to dilate even more, and he continues to suffer from the pain. By now, it's hard to tell if it's from the tumor or the suppression poison. The old man's skin begins to darken, and he keeps suffering like that for hours on end. He even wonders how much time had passed while he suffered like that. It could have been minutes, but it felt like hours. Fortunately, he wakes up, and the old man's physique is simply insane. It's better than mine, and I do weightlifting and jiu-jitsu. The poison worked too well. For now, the old man was alive, but he still wasn't sure when the headache would return. Even though the pills would help him survive longer, there was still a limit. He needed to stay alive at least long enough to ensure his granddaughter's safety. She was sleeping in the shade while he lay on the hot ground. There was only one way to have a body capable of curing the tumor and protecting Seol from danger. Body and bone reconstruction, a cultivation technique that helps martial artists achieve the perfect body. However, to unlock the perfect body, he needed a total of 180 years of internal chi training. The old man's chi was still at 150 years at that moment, and he wondered if he could reach 180 years in his current state. If he trained, it could take years or even longer, so he began removing his robes. Planting his spear into the ground, he remembered that, up until now, he had lived a life without regrets, but now he had only one thing in mind. He, Liu Jinshan, grandfather of Liu Seol, would never die. We see a small village illuminated by a few lanterns inside modest houses. Thinking about how he had been eating roots over the past few days, Jinshan was arriving at the village. Luckily, he had found this place. And look at Seol's big eyes. For some reason, her silhouette reminded me of a ditto. Looking at his little granddaughter, he asks if she's hungry. Now that they found this village, they could fill their bellies. A smell begins to invade the old man's nostrils, and he immediately turns toward the source of the scent. Now we see someone preparing chicken stew. Some beggars were there cooking, happy because they had a big meal for themselves that night. It had been a while since the last time. The old man approaches, saying that the smell was wonderful, and the beggars turn with frustrated looks, imagining they would have to share the food. One of them asks who was there, and Jinshan replies that he's just a mere hungry traveler. Looking at the men, the old man notices that they must be from the beggar sect. And now even beggars have their own sect? Analyzing the knots on their belts, one of them was rank 1, and the other 2 were rank 2. They could be useful not only for food but for information as well. Jinshan asked if they could share a bowl of food with him, and the man said he couldn't imagine a noble asking them for food. One of the 3 was about to complain, saying the old man wanted to steal their food, but the third covered his mouth and invited him to join them. Grateful, the old man said that the beggar's sect was truly reliable. While one of the beggars finished preparing the food, he had forgotten the salt, and asked Jinshan to wait a little longer, as they would fetch the salt soon. The old man replied that they could take as much time as needed, no problem. As he sat in front of the fire, the men from the beggar's sect recognized him as the patriarch of the Liu family. They knew it was him because of his clothing and the baby on his back. Unfortunately, they weren't as good-hearted as the old man thought and were already planning to capture him, even though they weren't sure it was possible for them. The bald man said he was just a bag of bones now, with no way of having the strength he had in his youth. He probably couldn't even use his weapons properly. They only needed to attack the old man once when he gave the signal. Back at the spot where the old man was, the man apologized, saying it seemed he hadn't forgotten the salt after all. But when he looked at the situation, the old man had already eaten everything inside the cauldron, and he said the food was excellent. The man was shocked by this, while Jinshan carried a bowl to his granddaughter, telling her to enjoy her dinner as well. Turning menacingly to the man, he said it seemed he had found some people connected to the bastards who killed his family. The man was shocked that Jinshan had overheard their conversation and was startled by his acute hearing. Charging forward, the bald man shouted for everyone to kill the old man, and they all rushed at him with bamboo sticks. One of them, who was beside the old man and nearly landing a blow on him, shouted for him to think of it as an early trip to hell, but Jinshan didn't move. Raising a spoon, he used it to deflect the blow effortlessly. With that small movement, the man's arm broke immediately, and he screamed in pain. Another man was already approaching from behind, cursing the old man. A small explosion occurred, and the spoon was now stuck to the man's forehead, who fell backward, defeated. Coming from above, the bald man screamed for Jinshan to die, calling him senile. But Jinshan gently raised his hand, breaking the bamboo stick, and grabbing the man by the neck, choking him immediately. Standing up, the old man lifted the bald man by his neck and asked if it was the beggar's sect who had sent them to do this, but the man begged for mercy. Jinshan said it didn't matter whether it was on the orders of the beggar's sect or not. He wanted the truth from the man, or he would rip out his guts. The bald man explained it was all a misunderstanding. They had nothing to do with the culprits behind the death of his family. They were simply following orders from the alliance. This caught Jinshan's attention, and he asked which alliance he was talking about and since when he had a bounty on his head. One of the men, the one with the broken arm, pulled a paper from inside his clothing and showed it to him. Liu Jinshan, patriarch of the recently destroyed Liu family, had gone mad after falling into a state of chi anomaly. That was what the wanted poster said. Thus, the Murim Alliance was issuing a bounty to capture this killer who wandered like a madman, taking the lives of innocent people. The old man crumpled the paper. He was shocked to see such madness written about him when, in truth, he was completely innocent in this matter. The entire story of the incident that led to the destruction of the Liu family could easily be heard by asking the residents of Jinyang County. But the fact that the Murim Alliance had issued this bounty against him meant they were connected to the incident involving his family, or someone with a high position within the alliance might be pulling the strings of this conspiracy. The question was why. Jinshan was meditating and training constantly because he knew that, in this case, his true enemy might be the entire alliance. The problem was that even if he trained for the next 5 years to achieve bodily reconstruction, It was no different from trying to hit a rock with a pebble. However, he had to endure this pain. No matter how much, he had to endure it all to protect his granddaughter. If the involvement of the Murd3red alliance in the destruction of the Liu family became clear, the old man swore to himself that not even a mountain would stop his revenge. Even if it meant striking that rock 1,000,000 times, he would manage to destroy the Murd3red alliance completely. The old man's hand was already capable of cracking the rock using his palm technique. He was determined to resolve all this with his own hands. Squeezing the rock with his chi, he managed to shatter it, exploding it completely before him. Still, one question lingered in his mind. Why would the orthodox sects of the Murd3red alliance, which had always sought justice, do such a thing to him? Seol began to cry, and the old man looked back, asking if she was hungry. He had given her milk, but the child only stared at the milk without drinking it. Was it because it had gone sour? She threw the milk away, but the old man lunged to catch the liquid, not wanting to waste it. Laughing, he handed the cup back to the little girl, saying he almost spilled everything, and told her she needed to drink it to grow strong and healthy. But the little girl must have been Edward Elric's daughter, as she didn't like milk one bit and smacked the cup away. Now that's a temperament worthy of an Elric. He pulled out a skewer of rabbit meat from who knows where and asked if that was what she wanted. The little girl then looked at the meat and began to drool, eager to eat it. Jinshan pulled the meat away from her and said she didn't even have enough teeth to chew it, prompting her to start protesting. The old man seized the opportunity and said he'd give her the meat if she said, "Grandpa." The little girl began to try speaking slowly and managed to say it. He was impressed by her ability to learn so quickly. Even though she was so young, her growth rate was very high, and the little girl said "Grandpa" several times before him. This was the potential of her immortal body. It was truly impressive to see, the old man admitted. She still couldn't eat meat, but he would look for some ingredients to prepare porridge for her. Night fell, and we saw a deserted town. Jinshan walked with his hat hiding his face, avoiding being recognized. He didn't know how far the wanted poster with his face had spread. He saw a woman walking ahead of him, and approached her, asking for permission to speak. She asked what he wanted. The old man asked if she had anything he could use to feed his granddaughter. She hadn't eaten in days, and he was worried about her nutrition. She looked at the child and found her beautiful, saying it was a shame she had gone so many days without eating. It so happened that she had some breast milk and asked if she could feed the baby with it. The old man was happy and asked if that was okay. The woman said yes. After all, every baby needed breast milk to grow well and happy. She held the baby in her arms as the old man thanked her. She asked him to turn away for a moment while she fed the baby, and he complied, saying he hadn't imagined he would find someone at that hour who could help him so much. It was almost too convenient. Pausing his thoughts about what had happened to Seol, he asked the woman if she was eating well, but there was no response. He continued calling out to the woman, but silence reigned. Turning around to see what was happening, he saw the woman running with his granddaughter in her arms, and he shouted, asking what she thought she was doing. Screaming that she was going to be rich now, the woman fled with Seol in her arms. But in the next instant, she was struck down by Jinshan, causing the little girl to fly from her arms and into her grandfather's grasp. Her expression suggested she found the entire acrobatic display immensely fun. He held the woman with the back end of his spear to keep her from falling but called her crazy. He was about to ask why she would do such a thing, when something caught his attention. On a panel, there were two drawings, his face and Seol's. Even in a small town like the one he was in, his face was already there. He was being widely sought after. Jinshan didn't know that even his granddaughter had a bounty, and the information claimed that he had kidnapped her and was traveling with her. The Murd3red alliance was offering a large reward to anyone who brought Seol to them. The old man was in shock at seeing this poster. Why would they want Seol in the Murd3red alliance? They shouldn't even know she was still alive. Some people started to approach where they were, and Jinshan noticed it. Now he understood that it wasn't just the martial artists who were dangerous. Their wanted posters were all over Shaanxi province. The three men approached the posters and talked about how they were wanted everywhere. Everyone believed the narrative that Jinshan was the one who massacred his own family after going completely insane, and this made him very sad, as he valued his honor more than his life. That was how he had always lived. Ending up with such a reputation was heartbreaking. One of the men mentioned that not long ago, the Bayuk family had also been attacked and completely destroyed. They had been massacred in a single night. The old man knew that this family, besides being larger than his, also had several first-rank masters, and one of the men commented that the strange part was that they couldn't find the body of any child. Some people said they saw the culprits kidnapping the children. The old man was shocked. That couldn't be a coincidence. It was the same group that attacked his family. Moreover, it wasn't just anyone who could destroy a family like his and the Bayuks in one night. Could it really be someone from the alliance? The question was, why? But before he could think further about it, Seol started saying, "Grandpa." and he looked at her. At the time, there had been a great fuss about the rumor that Seol was born with the constitution of an immortal body. The Alliance had even sent elixirs to strengthen her as a gift to the family. It had been a very joyous occasion for all of Jianghu when Seol was born with the same body constitution as the Sword Empress, the greatest expert in history. The Murim Alliance was fully aware of Seol's existence. In the end, the goal of those bastards was nothing less than to eliminate him and everyone in his family without mercy, and take Seol away. Grinding his teeth in rage, the old man began cursing them mentally. Even if he had truly gone mad as accused, he would never do such a thing. Not far from where the old man was, the men from the beggar sect spotted him. They knew he couldn't have gone far because of the baby, and commented that his mistake was leaving them alive. Now they had the best assassin in the area with them, and they began chuckling quietly. The assassin said he would be the one to take both of them to the Murim Alliance, and the men confirmed this, saying he could do as he pleased. Observing, the assassin remarked that this night was very fortuitous for him. It was unbelievable that he would have the chance to make a name for himself so easily. He was still reveling in his luck when he realized the old man had simply vanished from his sight. This left him very confused. Still wondering where he had gone, the assassin didn't notice a presence behind him. The old man had a demonic expression on his face, thinking that even if he completely lost his sanity, he would annihilate everyone who had wronged him. Jinshan was about to eliminate the assassin when Seol said, "Grandpa," once again, drawing everyone's attention and making them turn around. But when they turned, there was no one there anymore, leaving them even more confused, as they were sure they'd heard someone say something. Running at full speed across the rooftops, Jinshan thought about how close he had come to falling into a chi anomaly state and losing his sanity entirely, and it left him very frustrated with himself for being so foolish. If he had seen blood at that moment, he would have become a mad killer, just as those Murim Alliance bastards wanted. Seol called for her grandfather, and he told her not to worry. He wouldn't let such a thing happen again. In Jianshan's view, his Seol was truly a beacon of luck. If not for her calling him at that moment, who knows what might have happened? She had just saved her grandfather. After realizing that everyone had made them their target, the old man needed to find a safe and secluded place where no one could find them. And so, 2 months passed. The old man was walking with his granddaughter on his back, and saw something, calling for Seol, who seemed to be sleeping when he asked if she had seen it. They had finally found a place to live. The old man pointed to a small house that wasn't in good condition, but for them, it was nothing short of a palace. It even had a garden and a water fountain they could use. He considered this a stroke of luck. Jinshan entered the place as cautiously as possible. There could still be potentially dangerous people inside. Opening the door, he carefully analyzed the interior. For a place that seemed abandoned and empty for quite some time, it was surprisingly clean. The furniture was still in good condition. Analyzing more closely, the old man found a small jade box and wondered if it might contain some accessory they could trade for money. Opening the box, he found some throwing needles. Perhaps an expert in internal chi had lived there before them. He also found a 7-string zither. That combination was quite rare. Thinking about it, Jinshan theorized that the person who had lived there before wasn't ordinary, but he decided to stay there anyway. Night came, the house was lit, and he was cooking something for them to eat. Entering the house with a tray, the old man announced to Seol that dinner was ready, which made the little girl excited. She must have been starving by then. Despite her young age, she could already mimic the words the old man said, and she responded that she was very hungry, which impressed him once again. She ate well, and the way she ate reminded the old man of his youngest son when he was a baby too. He ate without ceremony. Having lived an entire life as a martial artist and now raising a baby, he could even understand how hard his daughter-in-law had worked. He began to think he should have praised her more while they were still together, but he never imagined he would lose the chance to do so soon. Seol made a noise that brought him back to the present, asking if her grandfather was crying. He tried to cover it up, saying it was because of the smoke from the food he had prepared for her. Leaving the place, he said he would put out the stove, leaving Seol alone for just a moment. She watched him leave, and he started to think it was pathetic of him to show such a vulnerable face to his granddaughter. Was he too tired from wandering around all the time? When he discovered the conspiracy of the Murim Alliance, all he wanted at that moment was revenge. However, that could wait. The most important thing right now was raising Seol so she could grow up healthy and strong. That was his priority. A new day arrived. Jinshan analyzed the soil and noticed it was quite fertile, and the well was very close. The place was perfect for starting a vegetable garden. He was clearing the land to prepare it, planning to plant several different vegetables so Seol could eat well. The old man raised the hoe to till the land, and we saw that his body was in great shape, at least outwardly, because suddenly, his back cracked, and he felt immense pain. He heard Seol's voice, and when he looked back, he saw the little girl could already stand on her own. She was learning things at an extraordinary speed. Impressed by this, he told her to try walking, and she tried but tripped over a rock and fell. The old man managed to catch her before she hit the ground and was overjoyed to see how much she had grown. Jinshan asked if she wanted to play with him around the house, and she nodded, excited to play with her grandfather. They began walking together, the old man a bit more hunched from the pain in his back but still happy to be with Seol. Another night came, and Jinshan looked at Seol, who was already asleep, thinking she must have been exhausted after learning to walk. She slept quietly like an angel. He thought he needed to feed her meat the next day, so he grabbed his spear and decided to go hunting. Running through the forest at high speed, he thought that wild animals became more sensitive in the dark, so he used his body lightning technique. Sensing a presence, he stopped running. It seemed like there was a large deer nearby. If he left the animal roaming around, it could ruin the garden he was cultivating. Resuming his run, he tracked the animal to capture it. As long as he could remove the smell from the meat, he could use it as food. Something caught his attention, and he looked to the side. There were some people nearby, which startled him a bit. He hadn't imagined there could be more people in that mountain besides him and Seol. A larger man was speaking with two others, asking why they were so late and if they had brought the toll fee from those bastards. Analyzing the situation from afar, he wondered if that mountain was some kind of hideout for bandits. The man asked where the others were, and the two replied that their support came from the Wudang sect and that 2 Taoists were protecting them. Shocked, the first man asked if that meant their brothers had been eliminated by the Taoists, and the long-haired one confirmed, apologizing. But he also mentions that they managed to eliminate one of the Taoists, who was a second-generation disciple of the Wudang sect. The one with the bandana asks about the other, and the long-haired man responds that he managed to escape when the bandit reinforcements arrived. Shouting, the man with the bandana calls the other 2 cowardly idiots. If they were going to eliminate the Taoists, they should have killed both, not just one. Now everything was over for them. The old man, overhearing the conversation from a distance, agrees. They should have eliminated all the evidence by killing both of them. And now that they had provoked the Wudang sect, a punitive force would be formed. Soon, that place would become the stage for a bloodbath. Jinshan thinks that this mountain is his and Seol's home. He needed to draw a line before those bandits dragged them into their troubles. Hearing a distant noise, the man with the bandana turns to look at what it was. Shouting, he asks who the rat hiding there was, and the other 2 start yelling for them to come out of hiding. With his spear on his back, Jinshan laughs and says that's no way to talk to an elder. The bandits ask what he's doing there, and he responds with another question. Aren't you going to greet your new neighbor? Confident, the man with the bandana asks if the old man has gone crazy, and the long-haired one says he was probably abandoned by his children and got lost there. They start calling the old man crazy again, and we can see he's getting quite irritated by this. The man with the bandana begins to threaten the old man, saying that if he still wanted to die of natural causes, he'd better leave, as the mountain belonged to them. Jinshan says that mountains can have owners since they belong to nature. He tells them to inform their leader that an old man has moved there, so they shouldn't even set foot near his house unless they wanted to see blood. At this moment, the old man adopts a terrifying posture, which intimidates the men. They bow, nodding at the old man's command, and say they'll inform their leader immediately. But in the next moment, the man with the bandana asks if that's what he wanted to hear. Jinshan responds that it's not. He had already guessed that the bandits wouldn't do as he said. The bandits become furious and call him crazy again. Were they joking? Then the long-haired man charges forward with his sword in hand. Shouting, he says he'll bury the old man right there since he loves nature so much. But the old man doesn't even bother to move. Thinking to himself, he decides that if he wants to make sure they don't approach his house, he must show them the difference in power between them. With just one finger, Jinshan flicks the blade, sending the bandit flying backward, and breaking the sword with the strike. In the next instant, the man with the bandana was already charging with his own sword to attack the old man. He makes a vertical slash that seems to have hit Jinshan squarely on the neck. The man with the bandana was confident he had struck the old man, and was already lamenting his death, saying the old man should have obeyed them earlier. But Jinshan was already behind him, and when he started speaking, the bandit was startled. Jinshan asks if that's what he wanted to say the whole time, and raises his palm to use the 4th movement of the Liu family's palm technique, rear lightning. A chi explosion occurs on the bandit's back, making him feel immense pain, causing him to bend forward, screaming in agony. Jinshan tells him to stop being dramatic, and then he realizes nothing serious had happened to him. Annoyed, the bandit looks to the side, and charges again with his sword in hand. But an air explosion occurs behind him, creating a hole in a nearby tree, which explodes further, causing massive destruction throughout the forest. The area turns into a clearing after all the nearby trees are snapped in half, and Jinshan says that although he wanted to fix their manners, he'll let it go this time since it's their first meeting, and he orders them to leave. Someone then asks what he means by leave, and amidst the dust, an imposing figure appears. A gigantic bald man asks if a landslide just occurred, and the man with the bandana recognizes him as the deputy leader of the bandits. The man was enormous, almost twice the size of the old man, with one eye closed and carrying a massive axe, and the old man comments that he isn't very sophisticated. He seemed to know a bit about martial arts. Calling the old man pathetic, the bald man asked if they were arguing with the old man. In the next instant he turned, swinging his axe at the old man, shouting that all they had to do was cut him in half. With a simple and quick movement, the old man dodged the axe strike and used his first palm technique, trace-free destruction. He delivered a strike right below the bald man's chin, snapping his head backward, sending him flying and crashing into the ground. The bald man landed far away, and the bandana-wearing man screamed for his vice leader. Falling to the ground like a sack of garbage, the three bandits stared in terror at the scene before them. Cursing, the old man asked if he hadn't already told them he wouldn't let them escape a second time. He ordered them to get out of his sight and never return. But at that moment, his headache returned, more intense than ever. It was the worst possible time for it to strike. He began writhing in pain, falling to the ground. The bandits looked on, slightly concerned, wondering what had suddenly happened to him. Jinshan thought he couldn't collapse there, so he quickly took one of the suppression pills. Seol was waiting for him at home. He screamed in pain as the bandits stood in confusion. One of them seemed to recognize the suppression pill, and the headache was soon replaced by the venom's agonizing pain in the old man's head. The bandits thought it was madness, but realizing he wouldn't be able to move for some time, they shouted that it was the perfect time to attack and charge to finish him off. They attacked the old man with everything they had, kicking and cursing him. They landed heavy kicks on his neck, and it was a miracle it didn't break. The old man was truly made of steel. As they stomped on him, they screamed that they wouldn't let him die easily. They would torture him as much as they could. His eyes slowly began to close, but he started thinking about Seol, who was waiting for him alone at home. If he died there, Seol would be left unprotected. Everything went black for a moment, and then the old man began to hear a voice asking if this was the old man they had mentioned. Another voice responded, saying he had caused quite a commotion, but they had taken the opportunity to teach him a lesson. Opening his eyes, the old man saw a red-haired man slapping the face of the bandana-wearing bandit. The smaller bandit was shocked and asked the red-haired man why he had done that. He was about to argue in his defense, when the man raised his hand again and, with another slap, asked if he was some kind of idiot. How could he have tied up the old man like that? Awake, Jinshan wondered how much time had passed since he had fainted. His granddaughter was alone while he was stuck there. The red-haired man noticed he had regained consciousness, and said it seemed the old man had recovered his senses. The old man said nothing, but he wondered if this was the leader of the bandits. The man approached the old man, and said his men had been very rude to him, calling him elder. All the old man could think about was why this man had spared his life. Acknowledging that his subordinates' actions had been unpleasant, the red-haired man apologized on their behalf, but the protagonist could only think of him as despicable. Believing he already had an idea of what the red-haired man's plan was, he remained silent. Jinshan was unwilling to cooperate with those bandits. He needed to return to his granddaughter as quickly as possible, but he was completely tied up and couldn't break the chains. Once again, the red-haired man apologized to the old man, and he replied that if he was truly sorry, he should release him first. The man seemed sincere and shouted at his subordinate to bring the keys immediately to free the old man. The bandana-wearing man complied and brought them to him. Taking the keys, the red-haired man said he would first remove the chains from his body and then unlock the cuffs that bound him to the post. He asked the old man to calm his anger, but the moment the chains were removed, Jinshan kicked the man, sending him flying backward. Recognizing the old man's strength, he admitted he had expected the elder to possess an enormous amount of internal chi. Jinshan managed to rip the wooden post from the ground and charged at the red-haired man, but the bald man leapt forward, swinging his axe to strike the old man. Seizing the opportunity, Jinshan broke free of his chains and landed a strike on the bald man, sending him flying as well. Advancing, Jinshan approaches the large man who was falling to the ground and stomps hard on his face, smashing it down. Using the bald man's face as a springboard, he leaps away to escape the presence of the bandits. The large man screams for them to kill him, and from above, the old man sees that there are several bandits on the ground, just waiting for him to land so they can attack. Someone shouts for the archers to use their arrows to bring him down, and they obey. It was difficult for the MC to dodge all the arrows flying his way, and he was already preparing to lose at least one arm in this battle. The archers had the old man in their sights, when someone shouted that they shouldn't shoot. It was the red-haired man, telling them to let him go. Still in the air, Jinshan manages to pass over the walls of the bandits' camp, and landing on the ground, begins to make his escape. He thinks of his granddaughter, and says he's on his way. The red-haired man was impressed by what he saw. Jinshan was truly a master. Approaching the leader, the bald man asks why he let him escape, mentioning that some of their men had disappeared in the mountains, and that he believed it was the old man's doing. But the leader interrupts him, saying he was trying to clean up the mess they had created. The fate of the Black Blade Mountain depended on that old man. "That guy knows something we don't," he added. Arriving home, the old man shouts for his granddaughter, announcing that he has returned home. He looks around, trying to figure out if any beasts had invaded the house or caused harm to Seol, and he shouts her name, asking her to respond. Yelling, Seol comes running, and the old man notices her presence, and rushes to hug and console her, telling her that he's back. Believing she had been alone and scared all that time, he apologizes and says he'll never leave her alone again. He tells his granddaughter to stop croaking, but she was actually holding a frog in her hands. He praises her talent for catching a frog so easily. Asking if she's hungry, he tells her to wait a bit, but he suddenly stops speaking, because he notices something unsettling. Placing his granddaughter behind him, the old man says he thought he had warned them not to come near. Did they come here to end their lives, perhaps? The men kneel before the two, begging forgiveness for the trouble they had caused them, leaving the MC confused. Thinking he had neither the time nor the desire to deal with these bandits, the old man simply responds that he understands and tells them to leave. The red-haired man appears and says he's there to return his spear. It seemed quite precious to him, but he had dropped it when he collapsed from the pain. He mentions that living on the mountain with a baby would be challenging and suggests that it would be beneficial for them to be neighbors who help each other. Jinshan responds by asking if he thinks the old man doesn't know about their cheap tricks. He knows the bandits messed with members of the Wudang sect, so their fate is sealed, like a candle burning in the wind. Perhaps they wanted to use the old man to protect them when the Wudang sect attacked. Hearing this, the red-haired man becomes nervous, and the old man says that if he doesn't want trouble with him, he'd better leave right now. Understanding, the red-haired man apologizes if he was rude and says that if the old man needs anything, he can contact them at their hideout anytime. As a further gesture of apology, he leaves a sack on the ground as a gift, and then turns and walks away with his companions. The old man was still suspicious of the sack's contents, but Seol had already dived into it to see what was inside. Jinshan pulls her out of the sack, wondering what might be in there, but the girl was already holding a giant snake in her hands. The snake strikes at the two, but the old man reacts much faster and neutralizes it. He was furious that they left a snake in the sack to attack them, but Seol didn't seem to have suffered at all. On the contrary, she was playing happily, running around. Still, they had left plenty of food inside the sack for them to eat, so they weren't entirely bad. The night continued and dinner had already been devoured by the two. The MC and his granddaughter were stuffed from eating so much. It had been a long time since they'd eaten so well. It was a wonderful feeling. But it wasn't time to relax just yet. He begins to get up, knowing he couldn't predict when another nervous breakdown might occur, so he had to train while he still could. He needed to reach the necessary amount of chi to use the body reconstruction technique, and this had to happen as soon as possible. No matter the cost, he could do it, because his ultimate goal was still to protect Seol and avenge his family. The chi continued to gather within his body as he meditated. Opening his eyes after finishing his meditation, he noticed Seol in the same position as him, though her eyes were still closed. He smiled slightly, seeing that she was simply imitating him, but realized that it might be better to start teaching martial arts to her, especially taking advantage of this imitation ability she had at such a young age. Placing his hand on the little girl's back, he began transferring his chi to her to aid her in training. Even though the child was asleep while sitting, Jinshan noticed something different about her. Her blood vessels had no murky energy to obstruct her chi, allowing energy to flow freely through her body. This left him astonished, because it meant the speed at which she stored chi was dozens of times greater than that of an ordinary person, significantly accelerating her martial strength. This was nothing less than the potential power of a healthy and immortal body. Realizing this, he wondered if he should start drawing more out of her soon. The process of accumulating chi was a bit complex, but transferring his chi to her was easier, and she could absorb an enormous amount of chi. She was accumulating a total of 20 times more energy than could typically be accumulated through a celestial cycle, all of this while still sleeping. Jinshan thought it might be better to stop for the night. She had already absorbed a surreal amount of energy. The palm techniques of his family were based on purity and an unyielding spirit. Their energy accumulation limit was higher, but the downside was that their training progress was slower than that of other sections. However, Seol's innate constitution could correct this issue and allow her to grow faster and more powerfully than anyone else in the Liu family's history. Feeling extreme fatigue, Jinshan began to complain about his body. It was difficult for him because he was low on energy. If he were a bit younger, things would be different. He sat outside the house, looking at a jar. Inside it was some excellent wine, but initially, He resisted the temptation to drink it, even though it could help his energy. The bandit's gift wouldn't make him fall into their trap. Shortly after, we saw that what he told himself didn't matter at all, as the snake was already skewered and roasting over the fire, while he sipped a portion of the wine. It was great. He hadn't had such good alcohol in a long time. Taking a bite of the snake meat, he thought its taste was wonderful, very delicate. Moments like these made the world a great place to live. He was making the most of the time he had left, and he wondered if he should pour himself another glass of wine before going to sleep. Looking at the moon, he started noticing something strange. It was as if it were beginning to liquefy. Alarmed by this, he kept staring upward, not realizing he was spilling his wine. It was as if a piece of the moon was detaching and moving toward him, leaving him utterly confused. The beam of light passed over him, and still staring, he wondered if it was some kind of will-o'-the-wisp. It was bright and beautiful. Was he hallucinating because of the alcohol? His eyes appeared strange, dull, as if he were dead. He ran after the light, wishing to see it up close. As if possessed, he chased the light and found something he had only heard of in legends told by adults when he was a child, long ago. With dark blue fur, it was an animal that had devoured over 1,000 people in the past 12,000 years. At that moment, it was already feeding on another person, the man-eating wolf with blue eyes. This must be the weird cousin of the blue-eyed white dragon. Turning in the old man's direction, the wolf began searching for him, but Jinshan was hidden behind a bush, making as little noise as possible. He couldn't believe a mythical creature was there, but faced with this, he had only two choices: grab Seol and flee immediately, or eliminate that monster at any cost. He gathered energy in his hand, and the monstrous wolf had already sensed his presence. Opening its giant maw, the wolf charges for an attack, but the MC's fist was already clenched and charged with energy. He uses the first style of the palm technique, but with a closed hand. What kind of crazy palm technique uses a closed hand? Opening his hand at the last centimeter, he manages to grab the wolf's jaw, but it's not his physical hand, it's his chi in the shape of a hand. That was the technique. The wolf is thrown backward, despite being at least 5 or 6 times larger than the old man. He really was strong, wasn't he? Even so, he feels pain in his hand. Although he managed to execute the technique well, the wolf's head was incredibly hard. This was going to be a tough fight. Already in an attacking stance again, the wolf prepares to continue fighting. It wouldn't be defeated so easily. It had suffered no damage from the technique. This was going to be much more troublesome than he expected, and the situation worsened because he didn't have his spear with him at the moment. The wolf charges at the old man again, and he still has no choice. He needed to eliminate it right then and there, or everything would be in vain. Leaping over him, the wolf lands behind him, and the protagonist understands what it wanted to do, as it starts running straight toward his house. Jinshan becomes desperate upon realizing the wolf had caught the scent of his granddaughter, who was sleeping peacefully in the house. The wolf ran at full speed, and the old man started chasing it. This was a completely unexpected situation, catching up to the wolf and sliding beneath it. The old man kicks it in the stomach with such force that it is sent flying several meters into the air, falling to the ground. The old man takes this opportunity to enter the house and grab his spear, as the wolf recovers and assumes a combat stance once again. The old man then looks at the wolf and asks how it dared to try and kill his granddaughter. He was already on the roof of the house with his spear in hand, and the wolf growled at him. Preparing his spear, he asks why it doesn't try attacking him again, and the two begin to stare each other down. Surprisingly, the wolf turns its back and starts to walk away, leaving the old man confused. Why was it retreating from the fight? That didn't make sense. It was said that, once this wolf chose prey, it never gave up hunting it. The monster was definitely trying to hide until it had the chance to strike and end the lives of both him and Seol. The day breaks, and the old man is already awake, carrying Seol on his back as he leaves the house. Thinking that he wouldn't be running from this monster if he were alone, he feels very frustrated at having to abandon a shelter he had just found. Unfortunately, he couldn't leave Seol alone for even a moment to try and fight the wolf. That place was far too dangerous at the moment. Now the question was where they should go after leaving that place. Thinking more about it, he also decides he should warn the bandits about the presence of that monster, or they would be in danger too. At least letting them know to take precautions would be the right thing to do before leaving. Arriving at their hideout, he sees that the wooden wall was broken. The monster had been there. Entering through the breach, the old man thinks the place felt far too quiet. It was clear that they had been attacked by the man-eating wolf before he could arrive to warn them. He sees someone covering the dead. The red-haired man approaches him, saying he knew the old man would show up, even if only once, and asks for the chance to properly introduce himself. He was Peng Ho, the leader of the Black Blade Mountain Bandits. Jinshan says he only came to warn them about the monster but arrived too late, and the red-haired man realizes that the old man was also aware of the monster. It was strange to think that the monster would enter the camp just to commit a massacre, and Peng Ho says it preferred slaughter to hunting. That's why it did what it did, since normal wolves didn't have such habits. That bastard wasn't a beast but a demon. The MC knew that even before the Wudang sect's retaliation, they would already be wiped out by the wolf, and he says he's done what he came to do and starts to leave. Peng Ho calls him by name, and the old man stops walking. Carefully looking back, he asks if the bandit had also seen the wanted poster, to which he confirms that he had and recognizes him as the sole survivor of the Liu family. They were aware of the circumstances and everything that had happened. Still cautious, the old man asked why Peng Ho didn't turn him in. The bounty on his head was excellent, and he could even avoid conflict with the Wudang sect that way. Peng Ho replied that, unlike what the poster claimed, the old man didn't seem like a lunatic who had succumbed to a chi anomaly. The alliance seemed to be hiding something. Besides, the child they claimed the old man had kidnapped was actually his beloved granddaughter, whom he clearly cared for deeply. They had no intention of handing over an innocent man and his granddaughter just to look good in front of the alliance. The old man was surprised that they weren't evil after all, and then the two bandits bowed, asking for the old man's help. They didn't want his help against the Wudang sect but rather against the Blue Wolf. The old man thought that, with their help, they might be able to capture the wolf, so he wouldn't have to leave his home, which he had worked so hard to maintain. Jinshan asked if the wolf had headed toward the destroyed wall, to which they confirmed and said they would soon repair the enclosure. But he told them to leave the wall as it was and organized manpower to prepare water, 3 branches, and bundles of straw. Without questioning, Peng Ho agreed and said he would do everything the old man ordered, but the old man added one more thing: he needed bait. The red-haired man volunteered for the role, but the old man refused, saying it had to be someone who looked juicy and meaty in the wolf's eyes. There was only one such person there, the bald man who had used the axe against the old man during the previous attack. He seemed to accept this without complaint and began gathering the men to collect the materials the old man had requested, knowing there was no time to lose. The wolf wouldn't wait days to attack again. Everything had to be ready that very night if they wanted to survive. By nightfall, the sky was clear, and the moon was full. The bald man was waiting with his axe, growing nervous from the silence around him. 2 beams of light began approaching him at an impressive speed. The wolf was there, its glowing eyes visible in the dark as it seemed to wait within a bush. Stammering a little, the bald man shouted for it to come at him, cursing and claiming he would eat the wolf's meat that night. The monster, appearing to understand the provocation, lunged with its mouth open, ready to devour the bald man in a single bite. But he managed to dodge by throwing himself to the side as the beast missed its mark. Falling to the ground, the wolf prepared to turn and attack the bald man again. But the ground beneath it began to give way, and it fell into a pit. As the blue wolf fell, the red-haired man shouted for the archers to fire at the monster. The pit was very deep, and Peng Ho even asked if they should install spears at the bottom. Jinshan explained it wouldn't work. It might hurt the wolf a little, but it wouldn't pierce through it. The archers began shooting into the pit, and their arrows hit the monster's skin, but they could only scratch it. Earlier, while explaining his plan, the old man had said that if they filled the pit with water at the bottom, they could trap the wolf's feet there for a moment, creating the perfect opportunity to attack. The wolf seemed to realize this, as it began to panic, while several men started throwing spears into the pit. The plan was to inflict as much damage as possible once it was trapped at the bottom, but even this wouldn't be enough to eliminate the monster completely. In the end, it would still manage to climb out of the pit. Peng Ho shouted that the wolf was climbing, and one of the subordinates said they had already thrown all their weapons into the pit. Someone yelled for everyone to get out of the way, and when they looked back, the old man leaped over everyone. Diving into the pit, his spear began emanating flames, and he aimed directly at the wolf's face. He would be the one to end that bastard's life, and a massive explosion erupted within the pit. Peng Ho shouted for them to seal the pit immediately, but what about the old man? Would he stay down there too? The men obeyed and began bringing wooden logs to cover the pit. They couldn't leave any gaps for the monster to escape, and that's exactly what they did. Jinshan, still inside the pit, realized that while his strike hadn't been fatal, the monster was severely injured. The wolf tried to attack him, while the old man was still on its back. The fight within that small pit was going to be far more challenging than before. The battle was fierce, the wolf using its claws and the protagonist using his spear. With the fight taking place inside the pit, the wooden logs around it began to tremble as if they were about to explode. Watching the scene, the red-haired man grew very nervous, until the trembling finally stopped. Peng Ho wondered if it was over, and the bald man approached him, concerned. The red-haired man ordered them to remove the logs covering the pit, and they obeyed. But it was too dark inside to see anything clearly. There was, however, a strong smell of blood. They began trying to understand what had happened and managed to see the old man, covered in blood, kneeling with his spear across his shoulders. The bandits wondered if he had finally been defeated. Peng Ho started shouting for him, and then the old man asked if they were done just sitting around watching him. Jinshan told them to pull him out of the pit because he was nearly dead from exhaustion. He had defeated the wolf. The bandits were impressed by his feat and started cheering and celebrating. The red-haired man even sighed in relief. Laughing, Jinshan asked again for them to pull him out of the pit. It had been a long time since he had felt the way he did at that moment. It almost felt like he was young again, and he remembered the time when he first arrived in Jianghu. Back at his house, the old man thought it was great to be able to stay in that home. He was resting while Seol slept soundly. Feeling some pain in his shoulder, he wondered if he had overdone it during the fight with the wolf. The pain hadn't gone away, even after a bath. He picked up a small green orb and examined it. It was clearly the inner core of the blue wolf. Even though consuming the core would give him a massive amount of chi, it was extremely risky and could kill him instantly. Weighing the advantages and disadvantages, he realized it wasn't wise to gamble his life on such a shortcut now. He decided to keep it for use only if absolutely necessary. Seol woke up and called for her grandfather. She still looked drowsy, and the old man asked if she had slept well. She reached for the pill, eager to eat it, but the old man pulled it out of her reach, saying it wasn't something she could eat. Suddenly, a sharp headache returned, and Jinshan immediately reached into his robes for a pain-suppressing pill, and put it into his mouth. The pain was torturous, and he began to writhe in agony. Endless screams could be heard from inside the protagonist's house, but there was no one nearby to hear them. The blue wolf's core fell to the ground near the old man, but he was unable to move. Seol noticed the small orb, and the old man, seeing this, began pleading with her not to eat the core, as it was far too dangerous for her. Unfortunately, the pain caused Jinshan to begin losing consciousness, and he couldn't stop Seol from eating the chi core. Seol sat in a corner with her back to the protagonist, and as he began to regain consciousness, he wasn't sure how long he had been out. Remembering the monster's chi core, he immediately stood up, worried that Seol might have eaten it. Seeing her with her back turned, he looked at her, and she turned to him, saying, "Delicious." She had eaten the core. Distraught, Jinshan screamed, "No!" and rushed forward, striking several pressure points on the child's back, likely to seal her chi pathways. Her face was flushed red, and he began using a palm technique on her. Still, he was amazed that her dantian hadn't exploded after consuming the core. Could her immortal body have neutralized the toxicity of the monster's core? However, if she couldn't fully absorb the core's energy, she might not survive. The two remained still as energy emanated all around them. Analyzing Seol's body, he realized that her fortress receptacle had been cleared. The toxicity of the monster's core had been completely neutralized and disappeared, merging with Seol's constitution and radiating true chi. Even her regent receptacle had been opened, and her middle dantian was unlocked. Because of this, the little girl began to float and then activated the ability to undergo bodily reconstruction. A child who was still a newborn was being reborn. Several beams of green light emerged from the house where the two were. The light was too bright for the old man to look at directly, so he covered his face with his hands. She had the ability to absorb all the true chi into her middle dantian. She was now slightly different from how she used to be. Her hair was loose, and she stood silently. Approaching her, Jinshan called her name, and in the next instant, she disappeared, leaving the old man confused. Running at an incredible speed, she started talking about a light, and then performed Homer Simpson's Spider Pig routine, running across the ceiling and walls, leaving Jinshan speechless and amazed. Not even he, who had dedicated his entire life to chi training, had yet managed to unlock body reconstruction, and she had already achieved it. Pleased to see this, he said it was exactly what he expected from his extraordinary granddaughter. The sun rose, and we saw a sack on the ground with the protagonist's foot beside it. The mountain bandits had left more food for them, probably because they had so much surplus they could afford to share. Grateful for the gift, he picked up the sack and immediately started roasting the meat over the fire, while Seol ran around the area. For days now, she had been excited about her new powers, which was starting to make the old man nervous, until she ran off into the forest, making him shout for her not to go too far, even though she now had an indestructible body. While still cooking, Jinshan thought it was about time for the Wudang sect's punitive forces to have executed justice on the mountain bandits, which reminded him of his last conversation with Peng Ho. The red-haired man revealed they had been part of the military forces 10 years ago but deserted because they refused to join General Yang Yu's rebellion. Jinshan listened and told them it wasn't their fault since they had made the decision based on their beliefs. Peng Ho explained that they avoided harming civilians, instead stealing only from corrupt officials and their associates. The protagonist thought he would like to help them, but he had his own problems to resolve. He needed to reach the chi level for body reconstruction. Seol arrived, shouting for her grandfather and throwing herself at him, startling him. She was so strong now that she simply knocked him backward with her push, and her weight was more than the old man could bear. In the next instant, she was asleep after running until she couldn't anymore. She didn't even bother taking a bath. the little rascal. Relaxing, the old man thought that even though she had undergone body reconstruction, she was still just a child, and he resolved that he, too, needed to achieve this technique as soon as possible and would never give up on it. A scream echoed across the mountain. He was holding Seol in his arms as she slept soundly, and then the scream came again. Startled, Jinshan stood up, wondering if the Wudang sect had already reached the area. They were one of the 9 great sects of the Murim alliance, and just thinking about their name filled the old man with rage, but he couldn't intervene for the bandits. If he interfered with their actions, nothing would end well. The protagonist felt a bit guilty toward the bandits, especially since they always brought food for him and Seol, but he still didn't want to act on their behalf. The Wudang sect had already begun attacking the bandits. The bandana-wearing man was on the ground, kneeling and clutching his shoulder, with a sword pointed at him. Placing the sword at the bandit's neck, the sect member said he would ask one last time for the location of their base. And if he didn't answer, he would be executed in the worst way possible, just like his companions who lay there, dismembered. Bravely, the bandana-wearing man said he knew he would die regardless of whether he revealed the location, so he asked for a clean death. Infuriated, the Wudang sect member demanded to know how he dared to speak that way to him, and his subordinates said they would cut out the bandit's tongue. But the senior sect member said he would sever his arm first. The bandana-wearing man had already accepted his fate, but as the sword neared his arm, a blade intercepted the strike, saving the most important arm of a lonely man like him. The scream the Wudang sect member let out was strange, as if the strike had caused some sort of bizarre reaction in him. The old man spoke, saying that using the blade of vengeance as justification to enjoy a massacre, causing slow and agonizing pain, he truly had the audacity to call himself a warrior of an orthodox sect. The men shouted, asking who he was. Jinshan replied that he was just an old grandpa who happened to be a neighbor to those idiots. Taking a firmer stance, the sect member warned the protagonist to stay out of it, claiming he didn't understand anything. But the old man wasn't going to back down. Jinshan remarks that it's true the bandit's fate isn't his problem, but in times like these, neighbors should help each other. He remembers when he helped them against the Blue Wolf. Thinking back to the massacre of his family, he wonders if someone like him had been there at that time, things might have turned out differently. Moreover, those bastards were connected to the Murim alliance, the main suspect behind orchestrating the massacre of his family. Raising his spear, the old man says that these two are completely oblivious. They have no idea what the MC has endured up to now, or how much he's trying to bear at this very moment. The cultists look at Jinshan and begin to recognize him. He was the patriarch of the Liu family, wanted by the Murim alliance. Judging by the unusual spear and the child on his back, it was possible that the rumors were true. This was the wanted man. They think this is a great opportunity to make a name for themselves and underestimate him because he's old. They just need to ensure the child isn't harmed. Planting his spear into the ground, Jinshan says he will give the 2 men a chance, as they are young, and tells them they can leave now. But one of them shouts, calling him crazy, and charges to attack, taking advantage of the fact that he had lowered his spear, thinking it was an opening. The sword seems to land squarely on the protagonist's chest while he remains standing. The cultist assumes the old man is full of openings, as expected of a retired elder, but in the next instant, the MC's hand grabs the man's face, and with a leap, twists the cultist's head backward with a resounding crack of a broken neck. Shocked, the other man screams in horror, seeing the cultist's face when he should be looking at the back of his head. But he doesn't have much time to process this because, in the next moment, the spear pierces through both cultists, ending the fight quickly. The old man is fully aware that, with this action, he, the Wudang sect, and the bandits have crossed a line of no return. This vicious cycle of vengeance will only spawn more and more revenge, and it cannot be stopped. Never again. But how can someone free themselves from the desire for revenge? The same applied to him. He would never stop until he avenged his entire family. Now we have the Murim's Kratos, who won't rest until he destroys an entire pantheon. Someone shouts that the man with the bandana, who we now know is named Sangdu, and the old man are approaching the bandits' base. They are carrying the bodies of the 2 Taoists who had come as part of a punitive force to hunt the bandits, but the old man dealt with them with a single strike. Celebrating, the bandits cheer the elder's strength and victory, but he tells them to stop causing a ruckus. He didn't say he'd help them. He knew very well that the 2 men he defeated were novices and weak. If it had been one of the masters he had known before who came to deal with this situation, a great disaster would have fallen on all their heads. The red-haired man greets the MC upon his arrival, and once again thanks him for his help. Jinshan asks if he's learned anything about their forces, and he says there are only 8 left, including at least 3 first-generation disciples. If they're first-generation disciples, then they're already masters who've mastered chi sword techniques, and only someone like Peng Ho could handle them. Jinshan asks the red-haired man about his strategy, but he says he doesn't have one. All they can do is set up a barricade and hold out as long as possible. The protagonist says that no matter how strong that barricade is, it will mean nothing against any of those first-generation disciples of the Wudang sect, because they know how to use the Chi sword technique. And with 3 of them, Peng Ho's group wouldn't be able to rely on archers to take them down. They wouldn't be enough. Just like they did with the Blue Wolf, they needed to lure those bastards closer and then destroy them with an ambush. The red-haired man is confident in the ambush strategy, but wonders if the 3 first-generation disciples wouldn't sense their chi. Jinshan responds that it doesn't matter. That's exactly why he brought the 2 defeated Taoists to this place. The red-haired man doesn't understand, and the protagonist explains that all they need to do is take out a few of the bastards before they can form the Wudang sect's sword formation. Night falls in the forest when a noise is heard among the trees. The Taoists were running at full speed, and there were at least 5 of them. The one who appeared to be the leader raised his hand, signaling for everyone to stop running and position themselves behind him. Now we could see there were at least 6 more, in addition to the leader. They had already arrived at the bandits' base, but it was far too quiet. Could everyone have already fled? This frustrated the leader, who had hoped to crush them all, but one of the sect members said he had expected this. There was no way the bandits would try to fight the Wudang sect. The men were still talking when the leader ordered them to quiet down and began sensing the chi in the area. His name was Qing Jin. He realized the bandits were hiding behind the barricades to attempt an ambush, but as a first-generation disciple, he had already sensed them. A young woman named Hyunli commented that there were likely over 100 bandits within the territory and asked if he was okay with this. But another first-generation disciple, Qing Ho, confidently replied that they could take them all down with ease, so there was no need to worry. Qing Wu, the third first-generation disciple, approached the woman and told her to go first, saying they wanted to see her skills. She acknowledged the order and complied, standing and placing her hand on her sword. But before she could act, something caught her attention, and she shouted to her companions, leaving them confused as they asked what had happened. At the entrance to the base, there stood a man, with 2 others kneeling and tied up. Those with sharp minds could already guess what was happening. The Taoists recognized the 2 tied-up individuals. They were their fellow sect members who had gone ahead to locate the bandits' base. The standing man drew a sword and shouted for the Taoists to listen carefully. If they didn't want their lives to end there, they should leave immediately. Then, he decapitated one of the tied-up men. The head flew off like a rocket, rolling down the hill, and stopping at the Taoists' feet, leaving them horrified by what they had just witnessed. The woman screamed, asking if they weren't already dead, but her companion replied no. Pointing to the one still tied up, he explained that the bandits must have poisoned and restrained him to prevent his escape. The unknown man, whom we now know well, shouted that he would cut off the other man's head too since they were making too much noise. At that moment, Qing Ho leapt forward, sword in hand, attempting to stop him from beheading his companion. The blade was already on its trajectory, but in a single instant, with a small movement, it was already at Qing Ho's neck. Reacting with incredible speed, Qing Ho raised his sword to block the attack and was thrown backward. Looking at how he had held the blade to avoid decapitation, he wondered if he shouldn't have lost his hand. He was confused. It seemed impossible that the sword's trajectory had changed in such a split second, but then again, he had done something similar before. Why was he finding it so impossible now? Using his foot to lift his spear, Jinshan remarked that it had been impressive. To think that Qing Ho had managed to block his strike. It was exactly what he would expect from a first-generation disciple of the Wudang sect. Believing Jinshan to be just another bandit, Qing Ho was stunned by the protagonist's movements, but he quickly flipped to land on his feet and cursed him. Charging forward in the next instant, he shouted, demanding to know how Jinshan dared to underestimate him. His sword was once again poised to strike him down. The blade was mere inches away from piercing the old man's head when Jinshan let out a roar, sending the disciple flying backward once again. Jinshan thought that with this demonstration of his chi, the strongest among them would likely attack next. He didn't have time to waste. His hands began emitting an energy that made his spear glow as he prepared his strike. Qing Ho noticed the incredible chi radiating from the spear and positioned his sword defensively to deflect the attacks, but he had to use all his strength to avoid being cut. He shouted that he needed to find an opening in Jinshan's stance, but it was already too late. The spear had already pierced through his chest, leaving behind a gaping hole in his torso. Jarvis, where's my arc reactor? The spear embedded itself in a distant rock. It was the third movement of the Liu family's spear technique, Flying Execution Spear. An explosion erupted behind Qing Ho. He was already defeated, and this spear would undoubtedly earn Michael Bay's approval. I even thought the old man had thrown the spear by itself, but he went with it, and now we see he removed it from the rock. But in the next instant, he already feels someone approaching. The strongest among the Wudang sect members present was heading toward the protagonist. He adjusts his posture as the man charges with all his strength and speed, positioning his sword for an attack. The old man remarks that he can sense a fighting spirit that is both gentle and strong, and then the man uses Wudang sect's first-class martial art. Jinshan uses his spear to defend against the sword strike and realizes that even though the man's internal chi isn't immense, he's still incredibly strong. The Taoist sends the old man flying backward, and uses the opportunity to shout for Hyunho to flee, but a blade pierces his chest from behind. Looking back, he sees someone he didn't expect, and he begins shouting, calling the bandit a demonic murderer. Seizing the moment, the old man also drives his spear into the man's chest while he continues screaming, calling everyone their murderers. Jinshan shouts, asking if the Taoists weren't there to crush everyone like mere insects in the name of their vengeance. They can reflect on that on their journey to the afterlife. When you try to take someone's life, you must be prepared for someone to take yours in return. The third first-generation disciple is shocked that the two strongest among them had been eliminated so easily. They would not forgive them for using underhanded tricks to kill their comrades. Shouting for everyone to kill them, the Taoists charge forward, and the others obey and attack alongside him. The red-haired man yells to the old man that they need to retreat, and they do, quickly entering the base. The third disciple, whose name I've already forgotten due to his irrelevance, shouts at them, calling them insects, but the moment he steps onto the ground, it gives way. It was a trap, just like the one they had used for the wolf. Everyone realizes they're about to fall, and the red-haired man shouts that they managed to eliminate a mythical beast with that same trap the fools are now falling into. Two of them fall into the pit, but the others escape and continue advancing. The archers already have their sights set on the warriors' backs, but the Taoist shouts for them to prepare the supreme 7-star formation. One of his subordinates notes that there are only 4 of them left, and in the next instant, that number becomes 3 as the one who shouted gains a new breathing hole. A second arrow hits him, and the disciple looks to the side, as a rain of arrows begins to fall. He uses his chi sword to defend himself, and calls for the remaining 2 to take cover behind him. He thought he could block the arrows, but he didn't expect the spear strike that came from behind and pierced his chest. The 2 remaining Taoists are shocked to see their master eliminated as easily as the first 2, and at that moment, the bald man appears, shouting for everyone to attack the remaining 2, and then they all charge. The battle was intense, even though it was just 2 against an entire bandit legion, and one of them still manages to escape, shouting that he'll make them pay for everything that happened that night. Peng Ho shouts for them to catch the bastard. They couldn't let him return to the Wudang sect. In the next instant, an orange beam of light flashes past the red-haired man's head, and the spear strikes the cultist from behind, just as it had struck the first-generation disciple. The spear, Michael Bay style, explodes another rock after piercing through the cultist, and the old man says that if he wants to make them pay for their deeds, he can do so in the afterlife. The red-haired man asks the bald man what happened to the 2 who fell into the pit, and the bald man responds that one of them died from the arrows that fell in, while the other was still alive, though injured. Peng Ho looks at her, and says she appears to be a second-generation disciple, and he wonders how she defended herself against the arrows. The bald man asks what they should do, to which the red-haired man replies that there's nothing to do but send her to the afterlife. One of the archers takes aim at the girl and says that if she wants to resent anyone, she should resent her own sect. She closes her eyes, accepting her fate. But the old man places a hand on the archer's shoulder and tells him to stop. And now I realize it's the man with the bandana holding the bow. He looks confused. But the old man said it was better to keep her alive, for now, as only then could the Black Blade Mountain have a future. While Jinshan poured tea into his cup, the red-haired man asked if the Wudang sect would stop attacking them again, but they all knew that wouldn't happen. The bald man said they didn't need to run, they could stay and fight to the death. However, the old man told him to stop being arrogant just because they had won once. Compared to the true masters of the Wudang sect, the men they had faced were mere fools. Peng Ho asked what they should do now then. Jinshan explained that a few years ago, at a tournament on Mount Hua, a Wudang disciple accidentally killed someone from Hua, and their relationship had soured ever since. As a suggestion, he said they should go to the mountain, take the clothes and belongings of those killed today, and spread them around Mount Hua, making it look like the Hua sect had attacked them. Peng Ho asked if the Wudang sect would believe that, and the old man replied no, it was only to buy time. The red-haired man was impressed by the old man's strategy, saying he was great at scheming, but the old man replied that he wasn't some villain to do such things. Seol appeared, calling her grandfather a villain in her baby-like way. He looked at her, delighted to see her. She ran into his arms, and he caught her, thinking it didn't matter if people called him a villain as long as she was safe. Nothing else mattered. So long as she grew up healthy and well, he would do anything for her. The scene shifted to a different location, where the sounds of people training could be heard. Many men were practicing with staffs as part of their training, and it turned out these were the mountain bandits training under the red-haired man's supervision. You never know when the sect might attack them again. Watching the military drills, the old man commented that it wouldn't be enough against the Murim martial artists. The red-haired man then asked him to guide them in martial arts training. Laughing, Jinshan said he didn't have that much energy to spare, which was exactly why he had prepared another plan. The girl was inside the prison, injured but still alive. Approaching the cell, the old man commented that anyone might think she looked like some kind of virgin ghost. She woke up and started yelling at him, demanding to be freed or threatening to make him regret imprisoning her. He said he would regret it more if he let her go, as she would return to the Wudang sect and pursue them later. With no counterargument, she merely called him a murderer. Growing more confident, he pointed out that they were the ones who came to this place to eliminate them. Once again, she had no response. He continued, saying that Murim was a place where power ruled. Wasn't she prepared to die when she decided to venture into Jianghu? The girl's face reminded him of his daughter-in-law, but she looked as though she hadn't been eating well. She was still angry with him, but the old man ordered the bandits to bring food. Soon they arrived with a huge piece of meat and some dumplings. They placed several plates of delicious food in front of the girl, leaving her astonished to see so much good-looking food. Drool began to drip from her mouth, but she noticed it and turned her back, kneeling as if to say she wasn't interested in worldly pleasures like food. She said she had her pride. Opening the cell, Jinshan said he had no intention of forcing her to eat, but she should know that he would finish all the food in less than 30 minutes. The smell left the girl in shock, making her desperate with hunger and drooling uncontrollably. Seol appeared at the old man's feet, also drooling, already preparing to lunge at the food. Looking down, he asked if his little granddaughter was hungry too, to which she adorably confirmed. Jinshan said the food wasn't theirs and asked what they should do then. The girl looked at them in desperation, finally saying they could eat, even though it was the last thing she wanted to admit. Seol was already hypnotized by the food, and immediately started eating. She devoured the meat and the soup in the bowl with enthusiasm. The old man said that thanks to the girl, his granddaughter could eat to her heart's content and promised to finish everything in 7 minutes. Would there be any food left after that? Still in complete despair, the girl watched Seol eating everything she wanted but said nothing. The scene grew increasingly unbearable for the girl. Her stomach ached with hunger, but she kept watching Seol devouring everything in sight. In a desperate shout, the girl lunged, drooling with hunger as well, at the little girl. Seol ran away, frightened, as the Taoist stole her piece of meat, and then began devouring all the food she could. The old man told her to eat slowly, otherwise she might end up with a stomachache, but she didn't care. The food was far too delicious, and she was even emotional from eating so much. After finishing her meal, the old man said she should follow him to get some fresh air. Outside, we see that it's afternoon, and the girl feels relieved to be free after being imprisoned for 10 days. How does she know it's been 10 days? Reaching a house, he told her to go inside and gave her 30 minutes. She didn't understand at first, but when she entered, a bathtub filled with clean water was waiting for her. He said she must be feeling quite uncomfortable after not being able to clean herself for the past few days and assured her he wouldn't force her to do anything. But before he could finish speaking, she had already locked herself inside the bathhouse. The water was warm, and the steam made her relax so much that she felt like she was melting. It didn't even feel like she was in a bandit's hideout but in heaven. Finally bathed, the girl emerged wearing new clothes, and the old man commented that she looked like a completely different person. She looked stunning in that outfit. She replied that it was because she'd been trapped the whole time, but she was actually a clean person. Walking through the forest, she remarked that the mountains looked very beautiful at sunset, and the old man agreed, saying it was a great place for a walk. The flowers were blooming, and she was enchanted by the beauty of the place. He then said it was time to head back, and the girl, startled, asked where to, already assuming she'd be locked up again. And it was true. Already being held by 2 bandits, he told her she had to return to her original spot and put back on her blood-stained uniform. She was shocked and desperate, asking how he could do this to her. It would have been better to leave her where she was instead of this. But the old man said that since she was a prisoner, there was no choice, and he apologized for it. The girl dropped to the ground, kneeling, saying she was wrong, and the old man asked what she was talking about since she hadn't done anything wrong. Shouting, she said that if they were going to lock her up again, they might as well eliminate her. She was on the verge of tears, and the old man placed his hand on his chin, thinking about what to do, and said that if she wanted, she could live every day like the one she just had, but only if she gave him something of value in return. The girl panicked, immediately imagining indecent things they might want from her. But in the next instant, the old man made her faint by striking her cheek points, saying to the unconscious girl that she would soon find out what they really wanted from her. Back in the prison, we see the girl waking up again, wearing her blood-stained clothes, and she begins to recall the wonderful day she had, filled with food, freedom, and a warm, relaxing bath, wishing she could be free again. Soon after, she remembered the old man's final words before he knocked her out. Still thinking he wanted something indecent, she told herself she would do anything except that. Jinshan appeared outside the cell and asked if she had thought about his proposal overnight, but she turned her back and scoffed in disdain. The old man said he didn't know when he would return to that place again, so if she had made up her mind, she'd better say it now. Still silent, she began to wonder if she would remain imprisoned forever if she refused what they asked of her. We still don't know what it is, but we'll find out soon. Continuing her thoughts, she told herself that if she returned to the Wudang sect after being freed by them, something unknown might happen. Finally, the girl answered, saying she understood, and would do what they wanted. Smiling, he approached the bars and said she was finally speaking their language, then told her she could leave the prison. Outside, several shirtless bandits were likely training, and the girl approached them. From what we understand, they had asked her to train the bandits in the Wudang sect's techniques. In front of everyone, it became clear I was right. She asked if they wanted her to train the bandits. The old man commented on the Wudang sect's techniques, which were so valuable that people would pay thousands of taels of gold for them, and added that, even though he had only observed her techniques briefly that night, it was clear she was very talented. He said it would be a great help for those young ones if she could teach them a bit about the Wudang sect's sword techniques. However, if the Wudang sect found out, they wouldn't let her live for long. The girl said she was aware of that but began remembering her childhood, and how adults used to underestimate her for being a girl, even saying the world would end because of her. A mere woman acting as if she knew something just because she had a bit of talent as a child. The adults made her clean instead of train. She remembered being forced to massage the masters when she was old enough to be a wife, and how they harassed her. Thinking about it, she would rather be excommunicated from the Wudang sect than stay locked up and die inside it. The red-haired man shouted to the rest of the bandits, saying that the young woman was now their instructor and they should greet her. Standing respectfully, they shouted, asking her to guide them in martial arts, and she found their military-like discipline impressive. Handing her sword back, the red-haired man asked her to please lead them. And what impressed her most was that the red-haired man seemed much stronger than she was, yet acted with such humility. Drawing her sword from its sheath, she said she would perform a demonstration. They needed to pay full attention because this was the Wudang sect's sword technique. Spinning on her axis, she assumed a battle stance, and began performing the sword movements. The first movement alone gave an idea of the potential she carried, and the rest showed why she was regarded as so talented by those who truly understood martial arts. Her fluid movements were harmonious yet powerful. She completed her demonstration as the soldiers watched, and they began cheering and applauding her performance. Trying not to appear flattered by the applause, she explained that the technique was called the Sword of Clarity and provided an excellent foundation for swordsmanship. It was time to start learning. The men nodded, and meanwhile, Jinshan observed them all. He was genuinely happy to see the collaboration between the Wudang sect girl and the bandit army, but he began withdrawing from the area to let them train in peace. A few days later, it was nighttime in the mountains, and the young woman was inside a house, alone, relieved that she had successfully taught all the principles of the Sword of Clarity movements, allowing them to cultivate on their own. Someone knocked at the door and announced they were bringing her meal, and she asked them to come in. The food was served, and just looking at it made me hungry. It was better than the food at my house, dumplings and meat with sauce. She was also impressed by the bandits' cooking skills. Thanks to them, she ate well and was able to rest a lot. This life was much better than what she had at the Wudang sect, where she was underestimated despite being the best among the second-generation disciples. For the first time, she was being treated like a normal human by others. She even thought this must be how nobles felt. Something caught her attention at that moment, and she jumped from her bed to investigate. Through the crack in the door, she noticed something strange. Usually, there was always heavy security near where she slept at night, but this time, she couldn't sense anyone's energy nearby. Grabbing her sword, she carefully opened the door of the house, thinking this might be her chance to escape. Running at full speed through the area, she reached the wooden walls of the bandit territory. Now she only needed to climb over the barricade, and she would finally be free. Her leap over the stakes let her feel the cold night wind and the taste of freedom. She landed gracefully and silently on the ground, but as she raised her head to look forward, Jinshan was standing there, merely observing her. Startled, she jumped back and placed her hand on her sword, ready to face him in combat. Unlike what she expected, all the old man does is ask why she's dirtying the clothes he worked so hard to give her. Confused, she asks what he means by that, but he simply explains that she can leave any time she wants since she's already fulfilled her part of the deal. This catches the girl off guard, and he asks what she plans to do, given that she can't return to the Wudang sect. She tries to answer but can't, and the old man continues, saying that although she's free, if she's not in a hurry, she should rest for the night and leave at dawn. He says he'll speak with the leader of the bandits, so they can give her money and food to travel peacefully. Then, he leaves her presence. Thinking it over, the girl realizes she has nowhere to go. If anyone found out she taught Wudang's sect techniques to the bandits, it would be a big problem. Getting up, she closes her eyes and decides to return to the house and rest. Dawn breaks, and we see the girl's small wooden house, and in front of the door is a small sack, containing food and money. He had truly kept his promise. Pum Ho, the bald man, and the man with the bandana approach the girl, saying it looks like she's leaving at that moment. Reflecting on their sincerity and how kind they had been to her, she thinks it might be better to stay a little longer, and says she's not leaving yet. Pum Ho says that even though their relationship started on the wrong foot, he wishes the best for her. She tells him to wait a moment, but the red-haired man says the instructor is leaving now. She tries to argue that she's not leaving yet, but everyone shouts for her to have a long life and waves goodbye as she walks away, carrying her sack of food and money. Her disappointed face at not being able to stay longer is hilarious. They continue shouting for her to take care on her journey and have a good trip, urging her to leave quickly. But she says they won't be able to reach the full potential of the Wudang sect sword technique without her guidance. In the next instant, the red-haired man approaches with his hand cupped to his ear, asking what she said. She repeats herself but still speaks softly, and the red-haired man shouts, asking what it was since he couldn't hear her clearly. Frustrated, the girl shouts that she'll stay and teach them the Wudang sect footwork as well. For a moment, Pung Ho just observes while she blushes, embarrassed for shouting that. But in the next instant, he bows before her, saying he's touched by her consideration. Wait, is this even legal? He asks if she doesn't mind staying a bit longer to teach more techniques, and she says that since he's requesting it, she'll stay. Pung Ho shouts again to the rest of his group, telling them to take care of their instructor, and they immediately comply. The red-haired man looks back, toward where the old man is, observing from a distance, and asks the instructor to follow him, but she says she'll only stay a little longer, though we know that's not true. Jinshan is laughing at the entire situation. It's clear he orchestrated this to convince her to stay longer, and he begins to notice something between the two. Seol is on his back, excited about everything and repeating what the old man says. He teases her, saying she doesn't understand what she's saying, but he begins thinking it might be time to start training her with spears. 6 months pass on Black Blade Mountain. We see the old man's house, and he's thinking that something very strange is happening. While meditating, he reflects that even after some members of the Wudang sect disappeared, they haven't made a move. Could this mean his plan to pit the Wudang sect against the Hua faction had worked? Or had something big happened that shifted their focus? He knows thinking about it won't help. He can't guess what really happened, so he stops meditating. At that moment, his priority is something else, and we see Seol pouting in front of her grandfather, saying she hates this. Jinshan is trying to feed her carrots, but she turns her head and says she hates carrots. He sets the spoon on the table and says that if she doesn't want to eat carrots, then she doesn't have to eat carrots. Getting up, clearly disappointed, he says she doesn't appreciate the food on the table, then walks away with the food, leaving her shocked. Seeing her grandfather leaving with the food and closing the door behind him, a small tear began to form in Seol's eyes. Then he returned, asking her what she thought about some meat porridge since she didn't want carrots. That was something she wanted to eat. She started eating the meat eagerly, without ceremony, making the old man happy. What was strange was that it didn't matter to her whether the porridge was made of meat or mushrooms. It all tasted the same to her. The old man was clever, almost too much so. Several days had passed, but the old man couldn't stop to relax. He meditated constantly to reach body reconstruction, as he needed to gather the equivalent of 180 years of internal chi as quickly as possible. The headache still tormented him, and there was a limit to how much pain he could suppress with the venom. Even if he could gain just one less day of suffering, he couldn't waste time on his goal of body reconstruction and protecting Seol until she grew up. She imitated her grandfather's meditation posture, while he picked up his spear, thinking that, although it was important to train his internal chi, he couldn't neglect his martial arts training. It was still too early for Seol to wield a spear, but he needed to teach her as soon as he could, so he asked her to watch him. Placing his foot firmly on the ground to create a solid base, he told her he would teach her the Liu family's spear techniques. The wind began to swirl around him, as his energy subtly emanated. The root of the Liu family's spear technique lay in the principle that nothing could disturb the nature of the wind. Even as it encompassed the entire world, the wind remained flexible and gentle, but when concentrated in one place, it had destructive power enough to pierce even the largest rocks. This was the Liu family's annihilating spear from long ago, a powerful spear art that once vied for the title of the world's strongest. At its peak, the one who stood at the center was a legendary specialist, their ancestor known as the Spear Demon. Not even the extravagant and powerful art of the Liang family could withstand the power of their ancestor, who dominated the world with the annihilating spear. However, After the secret manual left behind by the spear demon was lost, the Liu family lost all the power they once held. This was why all that remained for them now was the divine spear of the fire dragon. If only they could recover the manual their ancestor had left behind. Seol approached, catching her grandfather's attention. He turned to her and asked if she had understood any of what he had just explained to her, but all she wanted was for him to hand her the spear. He told her it was still too large for her but decided to place it in her hands anyway, saying she could try. However, the moment her hand touched the spear's shaft, she felt the weapon's weight and trembled, struggling to hold it. Jinshan chuckled at the sight. She was still too small to wield that spear. Frustrated, she called him mean, and he asked what he had done wrong. Looking behind him, he noticed a piece of bamboo on the ground and got an idea. Picking up the bamboo, he handed it to her, saying it was more suitable for her size. She seemed excited to use it. She immediately began practicing her first strikes with the bamboo, and he commented that she was already showing the stance and expression of a true specialist, urging her to follow him. The two began training together. He taught her how to lower her stance and feel the flow of the spear's blade. The first movement of the Liu family's spear technique was the extreme pursuit, performed using basic footwork. When executed, it was a high-speed spear art that left no room for the opponent to dodge or counterattack. After demonstrating the movement, Jinshan looked at his granddaughter and asked if she could imitate his movements, but he was startled to see that Seol could already execute all the footwork he had just demonstrated. At first, he didn't realize what was happening and started laughing, until he understood that she could already perform the entire spear movement perfectly. Astonished, he was incredulous at what he saw, realizing that this incredible ability was due to her immortal body, which had truly remarkable attributes. At this rate, it was possible they might witness the rebirth of the spear demon in Seol. Planting his spear into the ground, he began telling Seol that he would fully train her, but in the next moment, excruciating pain returned to his body. His back ached, but he felt relieved that it wasn't the pain from his tumor. He gave up and said they would train tomorrow, and Seol mimicked him, holding her back. Laughing, Jinshan told her she wasn't even old enough to feel back pain. Nearby, someone brushed their foot against a wire with pieces of metal, which generated a small sonic wave that spread through the forest and reached the old man's well-trained ears. Sensing intruders approaching, he immediately began preparing himself, wondering what kind of fools would dare invade his territory. 3 silhouettes began to approach, and Jinshan seemed annoyed at the prospect of having to fight so close to his home. But it was none other than the second-generation disciple of the Wudang sect, along with the bald man and the man with the bandana. She was happy to see them, and so were we to see her. Impressed, he noticed that her clothing had changed significantly. It had been some time since they last saw each other. Seol hid behind her grandfather and asked if that was a tiger. She asked the bald man to bring her a sack, and he called her the general manager. The protagonist was surprised to see that the girl had become someone important within the bandit group, and she happily said she had brought some boar meat they had hunted the day before for them. They had also included some rabbit meat. Seeing that it was meat, Seol charged forward to grab it, but the girl said the sack was heavy and offered to carry it for her. Ignoring what the disciple said, Seol grabbed the sack of meat and ran off, shouting that she liked meat, leaving the girl completely confused. Approaching her, Jinshan told her to drop the formalities and get straight to the point. They hadn't come all that way just to bring meat. The girl asked if he hadn't heard the recent news, and he asked what she was talking about. Could it be that the Wudang sect bastards had finally started to act? He asked, but she said no. They probably didn't have time to worry about them for now. Something very big was happening, and turning Jianghu upside down. The old man was curious about what the girl was saying, and tired of not knowing her name. I went back to earlier chapters to find it. Her name is Hyunhee. Jinshan asked her to explain properly what was going on, and she asked if he knew the Sword Empress. The old man said yes. People might not know the identities of the Sword Emperors, but everyone knew the greatest martial artist of Jianghu. She said it was rumored that the Sword Empress was soon going to perform the ritual of return to a virtuous life in Baiyang County, nearby. The old man didn't think it was a big deal, but Hyunhee explained that it was a big deal. It was the ritual of the Sword Empress. This ritual was a retirement ceremony where martial artists freed themselves from their past and grudges, but not everyone could complete it. This was because it was a golden opportunity for the enemies they had made throughout their lives in Jianghu to take revenge. And it was worse for the Empress because she had made far more enemies than any other martial artist, so a massive number of enemies would attack her. Hyunhee said that with more people there, it would be easier to gather information, especially about the Liu family incident. She was excited, but the old man interrupted her by asking if she was trying to use his family's incident as an excuse to wander around there. She began trembling. She explained that wasn't it, and he had misunderstood, but he said that if she wanted to live another day, she had better stay hidden like a rat. What did she think the Wudang sect would do to her if they found out she was still alive? Besides, Jinshan himself was a wanted man, and it would be too much for him to go to such a dangerous place with a baby on his back. He agreed but said there was another reason she came to ask him for this favor. He stopped moving away from her to hear what she had to say. Looking back, he saw that she was holding Seol in her arms, who also seemed surprised to be there. She asked the old man if they didn't look like mother and daughter and suggested that with the two of them, they could go there appearing as normal people. Even in the worst-case scenario, the ritual of return to a virtuous life prohibited fighting among individuals, so they would be safe since the place was secure. Almost pleading, she still argued that they could watch the ritual from afar. Jinshan began to consider the possibility because it made sense to some extent. From his perspective, this was also an opportunity to personally analyze those behind his family's murder. Grabbing his arm excitedly, he shouted for them to go together, promising to take care of the old man and even daring to call him Dad. She asked if they would go, but he didn't reply immediately. Is it just me, or does everyone else also think the rituals, security, will prove useless in the story? Night fell, and we arrived at the city where the ritual of return to a virtuous life would take place. The streets were bustling with activity, even at night, and some people were talking about the chance to see the Sword Empress in person. No one had seen her in person until now. Some men were chatting about the possibility of the Empress's enemies attacking her, saying they were there just to watch the fights. The bald man, no, not our bald bandit, another one, commented that, besides being powerful, she was also incredibly beautiful. Another man told him to shut up. A different man walked behind the one who had silenced the bald man, clearing his throat and startling him. As he passed by, he politely asked for space, and we quickly realized it was none other than our favorite old man. The man looked at him, finding him a bit odd. It wasn't as though this were some kind of festival where an entire family would come to watch the ritual. He only asked Jinshan if he wanted something to eat, and he said a bowl of noodles would suffice. The girls said they could eat whatever they wanted since Pengho had given them a generous amount to spend, and the old man noticed the closeness between the two. He also mentioned he couldn't even imagine how poorly she must have been treated in the Wudang sect before meeting the bandits, though she pretended not to understand. Arriving at a restaurant in the middle of the city, they entered, and Jinshan noticed it was packed with people. There must have been many martial artists there to see the Sword Empress. A fight could break out if people drank too much, so it was important to stay cautious, even with the prohibition of fighting within the city. He found a good spot inside the tavern where he could get a clear view of the entire place. Now that's what I call preparation and caution. The food arrived, dumplings and meat, which made Seol more than excited to eat. She devoured the first dumpling while the two began listening to the conversations around them. Someone mentioned a rumor that the true owner of the joyous inn was the Sword Empress herself. Another person doubted she would waste money on something like that, but the first insisted on the rumor. The old man noted that everyone there only talked about the Empress, and he began wondering if he should give up searching for information about his family and leave. Someone shouted for the waiter to bring more alcohol to their table, and asked when the appetizers they had ordered earlier would be ready. We saw a woman's leg, with a sword at her waist, and more complaints. Changing the subject, the person began boasting about having fought 5 bandits at once, alone. He claimed they were terrified the moment he drew his sword, though judging by his face, it was more likely they were terrified of his ugliness. A bald man sitting with the ugly braggart didn't seem to believe the story, which appeared to offend him. Looking to the side, the bald man seemed afraid, and dropping his chopsticks, he began stammering, and then shouted that the Sword Empress was there. Everyone turned to look where the bald man was staring and saw a woman with long brown hair. Jinshan looked as well, and she began walking through the inn. She was truly beautiful. She reminded me a bit of Aerith from Final Fantasy. Do you agree with me? That person was none other than the Sword Empress, So. Standing still, she looked forward, toward everyone in the room, and in the old man's imagination, she seemed completely different from what he had expected. It was unbelievable that she was a swordswoman. Sitting at a table, a waiter approached her with a bowl of noodles already prepared, as if he knew her preferences. She thanked him, and looked at the steaming bowl. Grabbing the bowl with one hand, she brought it directly to her mouth to sip the broth. Placing the bowl on the table, she let out a big, "Ah," and with a beaming smile, said that this flavor was what kept her coming back to that inn every day. The men looked at the scene, incredulous. Even though she was the Sword Empress, the greatest swordswoman in Jianghu, she didn't seem intimidating. Could she just be an ordinary girl? Starting to believe the rumors about her were exaggerated, they began saying they could easily beat her in a fight. One of them said he didn't cross swords with women, but if it were about drinking, things would be different, and he started laughing. Jinshan saw this and thought they were ignorant. That girl was definitely different. He looked back in her direction, but she was no longer at her table, leaving the old man confused. Where did she go? The man who had made the foolish comment about drinking was sipping his soup when someone asked why martial artists needed to be so rigid. So, the sword Empress, was standing right in front of them, and seeing this startled the old man. He hadn't even been able to sense her movements. This was unprecedented for him. No one had ever done something like that before. Smiling, So asked if that was the man's definition of strength, and he began to get irritated, provoking her, saying it was better than someone like her who could barely wield a kitchen knife. Without losing her composure, the girl then asked why they didn't find out exactly who she was. One of the men at the table stood up and cursed at her. Drawing his sword and leaping toward her, he said he would cut the girl in two. A faint beam of light was seen, and in the next moment, the man was upside down. But upon closer inspection, it was only his head that was upside down. The rest of his body remained standing on the table. Jinshan looked at the scene in terror, and we finally understood what had happened. No one had turned into a jack-o'-lantern cosplay. Somehow, the man realized she could have decapitated him with a single, simple move. He trembled in fear, clutching his neck. Jinshan, observing the situation, realized that if she had unsheathed her sword just a bit faster, the man truly would have lost his head. Luckily, the man also understood how dangerous that woman was. So continued to provoke, saying that if he intended to draw his sword, he should go ahead and do it. But still trembling with fear, he said there had been a misunderstanding. She didn't seem to take this seriously, as she assumed such an intimidating posture that the man panicked, thinking he would die right then and there. But, in the next moment, she reverted to her cheerful demeanor, and said she had also been misunderstood by him. She had just asked a question. Leaving their presence, she told them to enjoy their meal before she walked away. I don't know about you, but that felt like a kind of threat to me. They were relieved to still be alive, and Jinshan thought he didn't even have the ability to gauge that girl's strength. To think they had seen the sword Empress in person. He knew coming to that city was dangerous but was happy she had done so. The old man congratulated her for fulfilling that wish and told them to return immediately to the mountain, but she didn't want to leave yet. Jinshan said this wasn't the best place to try gathering information, but someone shouted that the leader of Murd3red was there. Everyone started looking around, and they saw that the leader was indeed approaching, accompanied by several other very powerful individuals. The leader of Murd3red was a red-haired woman with an eye patch, and her aura was quite impressive in the old man's perception. Watching cautiously, he thought that among those people, the one who had incriminated him must be there. Changing his mind, he said that seeing so many of them together, it seemed like a better idea to stay a bit longer and observe them. This made Hyun-hee excited. He said that, in any case, he had never seen the leader of the Murd3red alliance before and asked when she had risen to that position. The girl replied that it was about a year ago, and there had been a great stir in Jianghu because a member of the Ma sect had become the leader of the alliance. The old man thought that if it was about a year ago, the timing coincided with when tragedy befell his family. However, it was said that the leader's eye had been injured by the sword Empress. Hyun-hee added that, in any case, that story was just a rumor. The crowd began gathering in one area, and Jinshan looked toward it, confused. The Murd3red alliance warriors had formed a human barrier, blocking access to the street. One of them shouted for everyone to step back, saying they were not authorized to attend the retirement ceremony. A man protested, saying he had traveled 10 days to see the ceremony, and now they were telling him to leave? What kind of madness was this? 2 men in black hoods passed through the guards without being stopped, and someone asked why they were allowed to cross. Looking over the people's heads, Jinshan wondered if they were the elite guards. The Murd3red alliance bastards had come prepared. What was their plan? The crowd began shouting, saying no one would stop them from attending the sword Empress's ceremony, but one of the warriors grew irritated. He drew his sword, pointing it upward as the others continued complaining, calling them arrogant and weak. With a single sword movement, he unleashed a powerful chi wave, scattering the crowd and frightening them. A line was drawn on the ground, and he declared that this line was now the boundary between life and death. If they wished to die, they were free to cross it. That man was known as the Ruthless Dragon's Sword, Wang Heil. Jinshan didn't know him and asked Hyun-hee about him. She explained that he was one of the 3 greatest swordsmen in Sichuan, a cruel man who showed no mercy. As expected, no one dared to cross the line he had drawn. Someone shouted to the crowd wanting to pass, and everyone looked up, confused. Apparently, someone had used some sort of voice transmission technique, like a whisper, but Jinshan recognized this technique. Looking back, the bald man from the restaurant was startled and realized who was standing behind him. He shouted, saying it was the sword Empress. She stood behind the crowd, her eyes closed as she walked, holding a cup. Suddenly, her body began to vibrate. In the next instant, she shot forward at lightning speed, moving through the space the crowd had opened, stopping directly in front of Wang Heil. The man was startled, and she stopped just past the line he had drawn. She asked what they should do now that she had crossed the line, but the man began trembling and stammering in fear. With a slight smile, she politely asked to be excused and immediately disappeared with a leap, leaving him behind, humiliated. The crowd, realizing the so-called ruthless sword was frozen in fear, took the chance to rush past him. They began running, but he regained his composure, declaring that he had warned anyone who crossed the line would be cut down, causing the crowd to freeze. Disappointed, Jinshan remarked that the strong only attack those weaker than themselves and suggested they leave since they couldn't cross. Hyun-hee agreed, noting that Seol was already asleep in her arms. After eating so much, sleeping was the best thing to do. At that moment, something strange happened, as if a tremor rippled through everyone present. Looking toward the palace ahead, Hyun-hee commented that it seemed the ritual was about to begin. Seeing that the shockwaves weren't consistent, it was evident this wasn't a fair fight. The elders of the orthodox sects appeared to have abandoned their pride. A beam of light was visible at the base of the tower. In the next moment, something leapt from within the tower, landing before the Murim Alliance warriors. They were shocked to see her, but before they could react or speak, she leapt again, causing an explosion where the warriors stood. The entire crowd could see her leaping away from the tower, but Jinshan noticed something remarkable. The woman glanced at Seol, who was waking up, and gave the child a wink, before vanishing into the distance. Hyun-hee was amazed by Soso's display, but Jinshan couldn't stop thinking about that wink she gave Seol. Immediately afterward, multiple beams shot out from the tower, and someone shouted not to let her escape. Several of Murim's top martial artists were there to pursue the sword Empress, and everyone was shocked to see the Murim Alliance elders resort to such a cowardly tactic. But there was no time to dwell on that. Many in the crowd shouted to follow her and see what would happen next. Everyone began leaping toward the battle, and Jinshan was still astounded by all the commotion. He never imagined he would witness such a scene in his lifetime. The sight of thousands of martial artists using body-enhancing techniques to illuminate the night sky was awe-inspiring. Tugging on the old man's sleeve, Hyun-hee asked what he was doing, saying this was no time to stand around staring at the sky. They needed to see the decisive battle between the Murim Alliance and the Sword Empress. The girl was excited, but the old man placed a hand on her shoulder, stopping her from chasing after them, and said that was enough. He was too old for this. She grew frustrated and began protesting, but he told her she couldn't just run after a crowd at night, especially while carrying a child. Moreover, he pointed out that most of them were probably heading in the wrong direction. Many didn't know where the fight was taking place. Frustrated, she eventually gave in and said there was no other way. Jinshan remarked that in Jianghu, the more curious you are, the shorter your lifespan. But since she was still young, she'd have her chance in the future. Defeated, Hyun-hee agreed and stayed quiet in her corner. Running out of the city, Jinshan warned her that if she didn't want to fall behind, she'd better run faster, and asked why she was so slow. She replied that he was too fast. From what the old man had seen earlier, the Sword Empress appeared to be suffering from internal injuries. Her skin was far too pale. Hyun-hee grew concerned, but he reassured her that the Empress didn't seem too worried about it herself, which eased the girl's mind. She hoped the Empress would be okay. Jinshan asked why she wasn't rooting for the alliance since she was formerly part of the Wudang sect, but as she began to explain, he told her to stop running and hide her presence. He sensed something nearby and unwrapped the cloth covering his spear blade. Peering through some bushes, Jinshan saw that a massive massacre had taken place at the location. Shocked, he noted that he had chosen a path meant to avoid martial artists, while Hyun-hee was horrified by the sight of so many bodies in the clearing. A figure appeared behind the old man, and when he turned around, it was a man named Dugasong, one of the strongest martial artists in Murim, and he seemed close to death, covered in blood. Another elderly man groaned nearby, and startled, Jinshan wondered what kind of battle had taken place there. It was none other than the master of the Wudang sect, Master Jin Gang. Hyun-hee was terrified and hid, afraid of being recognized by him, but he already looked at her, and asked if she was Hyun-hee. He called her to come closer to him, but she didn't seem particularly interested in obeying. On the brink of death, the old man mumbled, asking why she pretended not to know him. He had taken good care of her when she was still part of the Wudang sect. Jinshan replied that he must be confusing her with someone else, but when Jin Gang asked if she wouldn't come closer to him now, she instinctively moved to stand by his side. The old man was shocked to see her respond to the command so instinctively, and she was already waiting for the elder's orders. Pointing to the side, he asked if she could see the person over there, and when she looked, she was startled. The Sword Empress was sitting, meditating. Jinshan realized she was gathering chi but was even more impressed that she had managed to hide her presence in such a place. Grabbing a sword, the leader of the Wudang sect told Hyun-hee to end her life. It would be easy since she couldn't move at that moment. He added that if she managed to eliminate the Empress, he wouldn't question where she had been, and would even make her a heroine of the Murim Alliance. The girl asked if he was serious, and she began considering the possibility of becoming a heroine for Mount Wudang. She could become the first senior sister and potentially rise to the position of master. Moved, she took the sword in her hand, saying that he really had taken good care of her, and then drew the sword from its sheath. But in the next instant, the cut was made on the elder himself. Incredibly, she didn't even hesitate. Memories of her past resurfaced, of when she was harassed, and she asked the dead man if he still thought she was weak. Furious, the old man cursed at the girl, and she was shocked that he had managed to protect his vital organs even after that attack. Rising with rage, he asked how she dared attack him, and he was paralyzed with terror, unable to move. In the next instant, the protagonist's spear shaft appeared over his shoulder, striking the Wudang sect elder in the chest with such force that it cracked the stone behind him upon impact. Screaming in pain, the elder saw the old man holding the spear. Jinshan pulled the spear from the elder's chest, and the man began cursing them both, asking if they thought they could walk away unscathed after doing that to him. The leader of the alliance would arrive soon. This came from another Wudang sect member, the first-generation disciple Chang Myong. Removing his disguise, Jinshan asked if Myong recognized him. The elder was terrified. Our protagonist was known as the greatest spear of Shanxi. Myong said they had been comrades in the alliance forces 40 years ago. Why was Jinshan doing this to him? Jinshan replied that he would ask first, and demanded to know if Myong knew why his family had been brutally murdered by the Mirim alliance. The question made Myong hesitate for a moment. Stammering, he tried to claim he didn't know, and the old man's demeanor turned terrifying. He asked if Myong was admitting involvement in the incident, even without knowing the reason. Myong was about to respond, but he interrupted, saying the alliance leader would arrive soon and they should flee. Jinshan agreed and bid the elder farewell, saying he would hear his apologies in hell. Myong began shouting that Jinshan was just an old man and shouldn't speak to him, an absolute martial master, in that way. The protagonist pressed the spear against the elder, asking what he planned to do about it, but the elder could only cough up blood. After eliminating the martial master, Jinshan remarked that his arrogance was as strong as ever. He turned and said it was time to leave. Seol woke up, muttering, "Sword Empress," and the old man asked when she had woken up. She continued saying, "Sword Empress," repeatedly, and Jinshan wondered if she recognized Soso too, asking what they should do about her. Approaching Soso, the protagonist said they didn't know each other, but he wanted to take her to a safe place. If she didn't want that, she only needed to shake her head. She remained meditating, unmoving, and he asked if it was a good idea to touch her. Jinshan replied that at her level, she wouldn't have any movement restrictions. He lifted her onto his shoulder, remarking that if she had obeyed the elder, they all would have been killed. He urged them to leave quickly to avoid trouble. The plan was to take her home, to Mount Yangzhou. They had already decided to save her. There was no turning back now. As dawn broke, they finally arrived home. He commented on how difficult it had been, and the old man remarked that although he had done most of the work, she had done well too. The girl offered to carry the Empress, but they were already in front of the old man's house, and he incredulously asked why she was saying this only now. They laid Soso on a bed, and the old man said she needed rest at that moment. Seol watched her with her owl-like eyes. He began to leave, saying to call if he needed anything, but he replied that his burdens only increased with Soso there, and told her to leave quickly. Looking a bit strange, she said she understood and promised to return later with medicine and food. After the old man thanked her, she finally left. Some time later, Jinshan was outside the house, feeling pain throughout his body and complaining about how hard life had become in his old age. He decided to rest for a while, but Seol appeared behind him, asking for meat. Turning to her, he asked if she was hungry, and she kept repeating the word meat over and over. He thought about the saying that it's easier to plow an entire field than take care of a child, while Seol continued clamoring for meat. Struggling to his feet, the old man said he understood and would go hunt something to make meat soup for them. The tumor pain struck Jinshan again, and this time the problem worsened because his suppression pills were missing. He suspected he had lost them during the escape the previous night. He fell to the ground, screaming in pain, and Seol ran to him, desperate to see her grandfather in such a state. Seeing his granddaughter crying over him as he lay on the ground, he began thinking he would die before his time, a fate he didn't want. But the tumor was attacking with full force, and the pain was unbearable. He started to believe he would die like that, unable to accept it. His eyes were starting to close, and he began apologizing to Seol, who was crying in front of him. Soso finally woke from her trance and stepped out of the house, stretching. She said it had been a while since she'd slept so well, but when she looked ahead, she stopped speaking and saw the old man lying on the ground with his granddaughter beside him. Seol looked at her with a very sad expression, and Soso was a bit confused by what she saw. Approaching Seol, she began talking to the little girl, recognizing her from the previous night. She introduced herself and asked for her name, and the child responded. Soso said it was a pleasure to meet her, and commented that they were similar. An immortal physique that echoes. A natural talent granted in all areas, including martial arts. Someone born with this gift possesses the 5 immortal senses, but if used incorrectly, there's a risk of becoming corrupted, like an old woman who once terrorized Murem long ago, or the divine jade witch Liu Seol, who led the demonic cult. Wait, wasn't the leader of the demonic cult Cheon Yuan? Oops, wrong story. Sorry. Seol asked if they were really similar, and Soso confirmed, but reassured her that she would grow up to be beautiful and kind, just as she was now. The Empress patted the child's head as Jinshan writhed in pain on the ground. He began screaming again, and Seol turned to look. Suddenly, a wave of energy passed through his body, and he stopped writhing in pain. Soso was doing something to his body that made the pain disappear. Asking what he had been eating, she remarked that she could feel poison spreading through his body, which turned out to be toxins from the suppression pills. Desperate, he thought that if she removed the poison from his body, the tumor might return stronger than ever. But placing her finger on his forehead, she said she found it. Soso asked if he was deliberately taking poison because of that little thing in his head, and the old man asked how she knew about it. She told him to stay still because if he moved, he might die. With a quick motion, she began transferring a massive amount of chi to Jianshan's head, causing him immense pain. It felt like a wave inside his skull, but the stones weighing on his head for the past 10 years were being destroyed. It was as if she were crushing them into dust. No wonder she was known as the strongest of all, and he was deeply impressed by this treatment. Soso was sweating as she maintained the treatment for the old man's tumor, until she finally said it was done. As he lay there motionless, she asked how he was feeling. His response was that his head felt incredibly clear, as if he'd been reborn, and he asked if she had cured his tumor. Standing up, he said he would never be able to repay what she had done for him, but she said he had saved her as well, which was surprising to her. She also mentioned she had a connection to this place, and the old man asked if she was the original owner of the house. The house belonged to someone close to her, but she said he could use it because that person wouldn't return. The old man thanked her and said he had nowhere else to go. Looking at Seol, Soso said she had a gift for her too, and the little girl shouted, asking if it was meat. Soso said it was something much better than meat, then raised her arms, making the child begin to float. Seol was initially confused as she rose higher and higher, but soon got used to it and began finding it very fun. Jianshan was worried, but Soso reassured him, saying everything was fine. From now on, she would show Seol the universe. Suddenly, the child entered a transcendent state, and a blue orb enveloped her. The old man asked what Soso meant, and she replied that if Seol understood the fundamentals of everything, she would achieve enlightenment. Jianshan asked how she could achieve that as a mere 2-year-old, but Soso explained that it was better this way to prevent her from being corrupted by her power, as she was still in her purest state. Immediately, Seol shot into the sky, traveling far away, and the Sword Empress said this was good. She was absorbing everything surprisingly well. Seol was entering the domain of the unrestricted. Jianshan was stunned. Anyone who reaches this domain becomes immune to heat and cold, their chi flows completely freely, and they ascend to the level of a superhuman. In summary, only absolute martial arts masters could reach that level. Seol began to fall after completing the ritual, landing directly in her grandfather's arms. Soso told him not to worry, she had only fallen asleep and would wake up soon. Jianshan was still incredulous that she had reached that level, and the Empress asked why he thought that. By breaking free from the mold she created, Seol had the capacity to awaken and become immortal. Approaching Seol to caress her once more, Soso remarked that destiny always unfolds in unexpected ways. Jianshan said his granddaughter had received a great gift from her, so he wanted to repay her with a meal, but she replied that she had to leave now. He asked why she had retired so young, and she explained she was heading west because she believed something had happened to her parents years ago. In her view, it was the right thing to do, to free herself from her past and resentments before departing, as she might never return to Jianghu. Moved by her determination, he wondered if her journey would truly be so perilous. What was happening in the western regions? Accepting her decision to leave, Jianshan wished her luck. He believed she would be fine, no matter what happened. She thanked him and told them to stay alive and meet again someday. In the next instant, all that remained was a gust of wind as she vanished at a speed faster than sound. The old man was impressed. Her bravery was not something easily found these days. To think that Seol had managed to reach unrestrained mastery, something that had never happened in Murem. Yet, she was still just a baby. Although he no longer worried about dying suddenly from his tumor, he still needed to achieve body reconstruction and protect her. Equally important, he needed to avenge his family, exactly as he had planned. Jianshan called Seol to eat, placing a bowl of soup on the table, but she had already disappeared from her bed. Startled, the old man rushed to grab his spear, believing it to be a surprise attack. Running outside, he shouted, demanding to know who the bastard was. But looking up at the roof of the house, he saw Seol jumping and shouting with excitement. Alarmed, he asked how she had gotten up there, while she continued jumping and enjoying herself. He saw that she was about to fall, and leapt to catch her before she hit the ground. He knew she wouldn't get hurt now that she had reached unrestrained mastery, but he couldn't help worrying and asked her not to climb on the roof again. With an annoyed expression, she refused, saying it was fun. Then, in the next moment, she mentioned that the big sister was coming. He asked which older sister she meant, and she pointed toward the bandits' hideout. Seol shouted for Hyunhee, asking if she had brought meat for her. The old man was impressed by her ability to sense others' presence. The little girl already held a large piece of meat in her hands, while Hyunhee said she had come to see the Empress, only to find she had already left. With the Empress's ceremony over, the Wudang sect could now return to investigate them again. Hyunhee asked about their training, and Seol said it was going well. Now that they had mastered the Sword of Clarity technique, Jinshan also asked to be taught something. Hyunhee asked what he wanted to learn. The old man replied that he wanted to learn the Cloud Step technique, a body enhancement technique that allowed the user to move freely through the air. Hyunhee explained it was a technique that consumed a lot of stamina and asked if it wouldn't be too difficult for him. But he clarified it wasn't for him to learn. He wanted her to teach the technique to Seol. Hyunhee suggested starting with cultivation first, as Seol was still too young, but the old man said she didn't need it. The girl refused, saying if Seol got hurt, it would be her fault. The old man said that was fine and got up, walking toward a tree. Hyunhee, confused, asked what he was doing. He didn't reply. Instead, he began channeling his chi, and used the palm technique to create a shockwave through the tree that spread across the entire forest. Hyunhee was astonished. That strike should have destroyed the tree from within, but there wasn't a single scratch on its surface. It must have been the momentum generation technique. Jinshan explained that it was the heaven and earth palm of the Liu family, and if she taught the Cloud Step technique to Seol, he would teach her this. He continued, calling it a martial arts exchange, and asked what she thought of the proposal. She asked if they could start tomorrow. The next day, they began training. Hyun was uncertain. Even though Seol had the same physical constitution as the Sword Empress, how could a 2-year-old understand the principles of martial arts? The progress was slower than she expected, but a month passed this way. After observing Hyunhee's demonstrations, Seol eventually learned the body enhancement techniques on her own. She definitely had a natural talent for the Cloud Step technique, but her landing was still terrible. She always fell, and Hyunhee had to catch her before she hit the ground. Once again, she jumped and continued to enjoy the technique, leaving Hyun behind, shouting that it was too dangerous, but Seol didn't seem to care. The training session was over, and Hyun was exhausted. She praised Seol, leaving her completely smug. Patting her head, she said the little girl did a great job and, even when she became famous in the future, she shouldn't forget her. Jinshan approached, saying that with a bit more training, her landing wouldn't be a problem anymore, but he was impressed with Hyun for teaching her so well. This left Hyun feeling smug too, and the old man teased that she was acting like a great martial artist who had trained a sovereign. Hyun said that what Seol was doing was different from her technique. It was as if she were the wind. The old man remarked that it was better that way than people accusing her of stealing the technique. Thanking her for her hard work, the old man said that now that he had taught her his palm technique, their agreement was over. But Hyun said she wanted to teach Seol one more thing. Jinshan replied that he had no other technique to offer in exchange, except his spear technique, which didn't compare to hers. Desperate, Hyun said she still wanted to teach Seol, even if he had nothing to teach in return. He asked if she wasn't busy, and she said no. The old man said it didn't seem that way, as the bandits arrived at his property, calling for her. They shouted that the Flying Tiger Fortress had invaded their territory and pillaged several innocent civilians. Furious, Hyunhee said those bastards truly didn't understand the meaning of fear, and since they didn't, she asked if their ears were just decorations. She said this with incredible bloodlust, but then turned to Seol with a warm, sisterly look, saying she'd see her soon. Hyun left with the bandits, and the old man remarked that her words and actions didn't match at all. Jinshan asked Seol if she wanted to eat, and she immediately replied, "Meat!" He joked that he'd break his back trying to buy meat for her. He then said they'd eat duck today, and the little girl looked a bit confused. Recalling the moment when she saw a duck for the first time, she remembered asking what those things were. The old man explained that they were a pair of friendly ducks and said it would be great if people had friends like that, trustworthy and kind. Jinshan said that until Seol grew up, they should rely on each other, and the little girl agreed. That memory made Seol tear up a little. The old man asked why she was crying, and she said it was because she felt sorry for the ducks. He then asked if they shouldn't eat the ducks, but she said no. She liked meat more than she felt sorry for the ducks. Meanwhile, in the forest, Hyunhee was running with the bandits, asking where those Flying Tiger Fortress bastards had gone. The man with the bandana shouted that they had appeared, heading in their direction. Drawing her sword and cursing them, She prepared to attack, but as she got closer, she heard them shouting for mercy, leaving her completely confused. They ran right past her without attacking, and she wondered what was wrong with those guys. The man with the bandana yelled that there was something nearby. A man was mercilessly massacring several others. The two bandits hid and began observing what was happening, and something left Hyun completely terrified. She couldn't believe that person was there. It was one of Wudang's 4 swords, the chivalrous sword Jong Hyun. He had the same surname as her. Could they be related? In a completely different location, someone shouted, asking why they had meddled with the Wudang sect. The man angrily pounding the table was Woo Ye-sung, leader of the Flying Tiger Fortress. He said that because of them, they too would now be targeted by the sect. He was arguing with Peng Ho, who said that since they were now in the same boat, it would be better to work together. Ye-sung wanted to attack as soon as possible. He wanted to avenge his subordinates, even if it meant dying that very day. Hyun-hee arrived where they were and told him it was pointless. His losses would only increase. Ye-sung glared at her angrily, and she explained that the one on the mountain was one of the strongest first-generation disciples of the Wudang sect, a top-tier martial master. Before reaching unrestrained mastery, which could only be achieved through enlightenment, a top-tier martial master was the highest attainable level in martial arts. Ye-sung asked if they should just wait to be defeated by this guy. Hyun-hee explained that they also had someone at that level on their side. Peng Ho guessed it must be the old man but wondered if he would be willing to help them with this problem. And Hyun-hee mentioned that she had already sent Sang-gu to find him. For those unfamiliar, Sang-gu was the red bandana bandit we already know. Still, she was worried about the protagonist's age, and wondered if he could rival such a formidable opponent. Until they knew whether the old man would help, they couldn't do anything against him, as it would be completely futile. A sound came from outside the house where the three were. Wudang sect's first disciple had arrived. The wooden barricade was on the ground, and with his sword at a bandit's neck, he shouted, demanding to know how mere bandits had knowledge of Wudang sect's sword techniques. Someone yelled that they learned it from Hyun-hee, though cursing her in the process. When the man turned, Ye-sung had his sword at her neck. The first disciple recognized her as the second disciple, and asked where the others who were with her were. She said she had no excuses for that, and Ye-sung shouted that if he didn't want her head on the ground right then, he'd better lower his sword. Unconcerned, the man agreed and tossed his sword to the ground. Frustrated, Ye-sung realized he was being underestimated by the Wudang disciple, but he thought it was fine. He planned to use the opportunity to attack, or so he thought. Before the sword even hit the ground, the man had already struck, cutting through both Ye-sung and Hyun-hee. Ye-sung cried out in pain, pulling away from the girl, while the first disciple turned to her and asked why she had done this. She tried to apologize for what she had done, but he was furious, finding it unacceptable for someone from the Wudang sect to commit such an atrocity. He slapped her hard across the face, saying she should have ended her own life instead of teaching their martial arts to bandits. He declared he would take her back to the Wudang sect for interrogation. Peng Ho grabbed Ye-sung by the arm and said they had no choice but to risk their lives in a direct fight against the first disciple. He shouted for his companions to flee and scatter, as he didn't want to see them slaughtered. He explained that no matter how strong the disciples' technique was, he wouldn't be able to eliminate them all if they spread out. Sneering, the Wudang disciple mockingly praised Peng Ho's loyalty but announced what would happen next. After severing their heads, he would hunt down every bandit on the mountain as if they were rats, cut off all their limbs, make them crawl, and then finally stomp on them to end their lives. What an edgy guy. At that moment, a familiar blade appeared amid the crowd. Jinshan was preparing for the fight, while the first disciple confidently believed no bandit would survive to tell the tale. Back at the protagonist's house, he wondered if he should make duck soup for Seol. She was still a little sad to see the duck dead in front of her, but she didn't refuse the food because, in the end, it was meat. He then started searching for the flint to make a fire, as he kept forgetting where he stored it. Pointing to the stone oven, she said there was fire there. When he asked how, she began conjuring fire out of thin air using the true Samadhi fire technique. Seol apologized to the duck while the old man looked at her, stunned. She was performing a technique typically achieved only by absolute martial masters without anyone teaching it to her. Jinshan was grateful. It seemed the heavens had blessed the Liu family with the seed of a martial god. He was overjoyed and praised the little girl. She eagerly began eating her lunch. At that moment, someone outside the house shouted, calling for the MC. We know who it is, but he doesn't. Sang-gu yelled that they were in trouble. A top martial arts master from the Wudang sect was there. The old man said that what was meant to happen was finally happening. Sang-gu dropped to his knees, begging him to help. Otherwise, not a single bandit would live to see the next day. Jinshan said he wouldn't mind dying to help them, but he needed to protect Seol. At that moment, the little girl told him to help them, saying that people should help their friends while they're alive, just like the ducks they had captured. Moved by his granddaughter remembering his words, he saw her smiling face as she ate a duck leg. and immediately grabbed his spear. Running alongside Sanggu, he told Seol she could stay at home eating while he went to help the bandits. The first disciple was still laughing, asking if Peng Ho really thought he would leave a single bandit alive. He said he would dismember them all, and then trample them before finishing them off. Wait, is he repeating himself, or is this a flashback? It was indeed a repetition of his last sentence. He even said he would make them feel like the useless trash they were, and then drew his sword. The two leaders charged forward, shouting that mountain insects don't die just from being stepped on. Believing that whoever struck first would win the fight, the bandits' swords were already close to the first disciple's neck. But he easily dodged their strikes, and with another movement, he sent both bandits flying. The man was incredibly strong and wasn't taking his opponents seriously. Peng Ho stood up, sword in hand, and so did Ye Sung. The two attacked the first disciple again, but he continued to underestimate them, considering them so irrelevant that he could barely see them. With a kick, he hit Ye Sung square in the face, and then another to Peng Ho. He was merely toying with the two bandits, but the redhead was waiting for the perfect opportunity when the disciple would lower his guard. That was their chance. While the first disciple was in the air, He was already behind him, sword in hand, aiming for his tendon. The enemy noticed this, and he flipped backward in midair, dodging her strike, leaving He to pass beneath him on the ground. It was absurd that he could evade her attack even while airborne. He had become much stronger since the last time she saw him. The first disciple found it amusing, even with a minor cut on his tendon. A member of the Wudang sect colluding with bandits? He said he would no longer take her back to Mount Wudang for questioning but would instead turn that open landfill into her grave. Ye Sung was already beside the enemy, his sword cutting through the air and nearly hitting his head. But with just one move, the disciple cut the poor man in half, telling him to stay away since playtime was over. Charging toward Peng Ho, the redhead noticed the disciple's stance had changed. He was completely different now. Was this the true power of a top martial arts master from the Wudang sect? His sword spun so fast it appeared as though there were multiple blades. And just as it was about to shred Peng Ho into pieces, he thought it was the end. His life would end there. But the rear tip of the old man's spear appeared just in time. Startled, the first disciple realized he wouldn't be able to dodge or avoid hitting the spear, and then he was launched backward by the resonance of the two metals clashing. The bandits were thrilled to see Jinshan, and he assumed a battle stance, ordering everyone to step back since no one else there was a match for the first disciple. The enemy then said that Jinshan was the reason the other Wudang sect members hadn't returned and asked for his name. Jinshan introduced himself, and the young man recognized the name, introducing himself as the chivalrous sword Zhang Hyun. What's with this habit of introducing themselves to enemies? Confident, the young man smiled. It was a pleasant surprise to encounter the old man there. He told him to remember his name, as it would be the last he'd ever hear. With an odd expression, the old man complained that his name was too long, and even mocked him, saying he didn't seem chivalrous at all. The young man responded to the provocation, asking how a lunatic old man dared stand in his way. The old man realized he was strong but easily irritated. Positioning his spear, the old man realized that his opponent would only grow stronger and more excited after a few rounds, so he needed to take advantage of this exact moment. Otherwise, if he failed to finish him in a single move, it would be the MC who would be deleted from life. The young man leapt forward, charging toward the MC, who also launched into an attack. The two blades clashed. This was the first round. As he was knocked upward, the old man noticed something hadn't gone as he'd expected. Looking at the young man, he thought he couldn't allow him to recover his breath. It was time for the second round. He used his explosive spear right where Zhang Hyun was standing. The young man screamed but still didn't release his sword. Smoke rose from his body, as if he'd been burned, but he still hadn't given up. The third round began, and the old man put everything he had into this strike. But Zhang Hyun made an unexpected move. That movement was the 8 trigram sword technique, a deadly technique taught only to first disciples. He started running toward the two, creating a scene reminiscent of Chidori vs Rasengan, with Sakura watching. The two warriors clashed, and an explosion occurred. It was still unclear who had struck whom, but in the next moment, the Wudang sect disciple began screaming in pain, struck in multiple places, while the old man landed softly on the ground. Though he was still injured, he realized his attack had failed. His shoulder was badly hurt and bleeding profusely. Back on the ground, the first disciple advanced, asking if that was all the old man had. Jinshan used his spear to defend against the strikes, and Zhang Hyun admitted that the old man was remarkably strong for his age. It was incredible that he could withstand so much. Peng Ho started shouting and running toward the fight, but he stopped him, saying he couldn't interfere, as it might only make things worse. Jinshan dodged a sword strike that even cut some of his hair, and the young man, excited by the battle, said that the longer the old man endured, the greater his suffering would be. His face was already filled with madness, The old man thought he no longer had the strength to withstand so many attacks. He realized he had only one way out of this situation. Swinging his spear at the young man's neck, the old man tried to push him away and succeeded, as Jong Hyun dodged with a backflip. The young man found it impressive that the old man had made such a reckless move just to buy himself more time, and it reminded him of an old saying. If you're old, you should just obediently die. What a terrible, horrifying saying, almost as ugly as the face of the lunatic who quoted it. Advancing toward the young man, the old man replied that he thought the same thing about him. Then, using his own blood, he blinded Jong Hyun. The young man closed one of his eyes to avoid being hit by the droplets, but it drove him into a frenzy. Enraged, he swung his sword wildly at the old man, screaming about how dare he throw his filthy blood at him. This strategy was one step back to take 2 steps forward. The spear moved directly toward Jong Hyun's heart. The old man, filled with hatred, wanted to see him dead, but suddenly, Seol's face appeared. Did she join the fight? With unimaginable speed she stepped between the 2 warriors, but the young man hadn't noticed her presence. His glowing eyes and blade were still aimed at the protagonist, until a small hand caught the blade as if it were nothing. Shocked, Jinshan looked back, and Seol, with an adorably angry expression, asked if that man had hurt her grandfather. We then flashed back slightly to see Seol at home, alone in the rain eating, but telling herself she was scared for her grandfather. Jumping to the ground, she decided to go look for him. Then, with a giant leap, she headed toward the forest. At incredible speed, she ran across the treetops, shouting, "Grandpa!" Back in the fight, Jong Hyun was furious about being dirted with the old man's blood and delivered a sword strike filled with rage. He thought he had struck the protagonist, but Seol's little hand was on his blade, leaving both warriors completely shocked. The young man tried to pull his sword back, but he simply couldn't. Seeing the old man about to take advantage of the opportunity to pierce him, Jong Hyun barely dodged the spear at the last second. This spear slipped through the old man's fingers, and the young man watched it pass by him without striking. Furious, his eyes turned back to Jinshan, who was already preparing a strike with the heaven and earth palm, 4th movement. Striking his palm into the boy's abdomen, the spear struck a rock and embedded itself there, triggering an explosion of chi with the lightning rear strike technique. The boy was thrown backward by the force of the blow, only stopping when he hit a tree, his sword flying far from him. He never imagined that a retired old man could have so much internal chi at his disposal. Jinshan yelled at the bandits to stop just watching. Were they planning to take advantage of him instead of helping? Peng Ho understood, and shouted for his archers to shoot the first disciple. They readied their arrows, and began firing at the boy, who desperately tried to dodge the hail of arrows coming his way. He rolled, ran to the sides, but he was tired and injured from the previous blow dealt by the protagonist. He noticed he was using rolling techniques that most martial artists would consider shameful. This was their chance to defeat him. She shouted for everyone to attack, and they obeyed, charging together toward the first disciple. Injured and alone, Jong Hyun wondered how things had come to this. One of Wudang's 4 swords, humiliated by a group of insects. Seeing Seol from afar, he questioned whether that child was an absolute martial artist who had used a rejuvenation technique. While Seol slept peacefully on her grandfather's back, regretful, he began thinking he should have finished off those bandits quickly and left, but in the end, he lost his life due to his arrogance. Sang-gu pierced the first disciple with a sword, and he screamed in pain. Crying, he thought about how much it all hurt, and began begging for his life as a sword hovered just inches from his neck. A scream was heard in the forest, and then everything ended. The morning arrived at the old man's house, and he looked at Seol, who was still sleeping. The little girl even had her tongue sticking out, exhausted after the battle. Peng Ho was bandaging the old man alongside Hyun-hee. They were both impressed as they glanced at the child. The redhead asked if the old man was okay, and he said this was nothing compared to the pain he had endured his whole life, but asked how his wound was. Peng Ho replied that there was no risk to his life, but he wouldn't be able to use the spear with both hands anymore. Hyun-hee, crying, apologized to the old man, but he told her this wasn't the time to worry about him. Now that one of Wudang's 4 swords was gone, even stronger cultivators would come for revenge. Winter was approaching. Jinshan said that if they wanted to stay alive, they should leave the mountain before spring returned. Desperate, Peng Ho asked where they should go. Their group was too large, but Jinshan scolded him, asking what kind of bandit he was. They didn't rob civilians and shared everything they stole equally. The old man explained that there was no reason to worry so much. All they needed to do was one last job and leave before winter's end. Excited, Hyun-hee asked if he would join the group, but the old man, furious, asked if she expected him to become a thief. They asked if he didn't need money. He would need to find a new place to live with Seol. The little girl snored loudly beside the old man, and he began considering the possibility of robbing corrupt officials who were already stealing from civilians. This idea excited the pair, but they decided to leave for now. They told him to take his medicine and rest well from his injuries. Later that night, the old man's spear was suspended near the ground. Holding a sword, he decided to cut the spear in half, as he could no longer wield it with both hands. There was no other way. Although it was a family relic that had accompanied him through many battles, protecting Seol was still his priority, so it had to be done. Closing his eyes, he asked his ancestors to understand his actions and bless him at that moment. Raising the sword, he apologized for committing such a heinous act against the Liu family relic and struck the spear, slicing through it effortlessly. On the ground, in 2 pieces, lay the spear. I thought its shaft was iron, but it seems it was wooden to have been cut so easily. Grabbing one half with his good hand, he made a few movements with it, and realized he could wield it with just one hand this way. He could even trim the other end and give it to Seol to use as a training spear. Looking more closely, he noticed something in the spear. Inside it, there appeared to be a scroll. Carefully taking it out with his hands, he read something astonishing. After 200 years, the inheritance will break, and our family will face a great crisis. Unrolling the scroll further, the old man was shocked by what he saw. A lost technique called Annihilating Wind Spear, the very technique that made the Liu family the greatest spear masters in Jianghu. It had been hidden inside the spear the old man used, and no one would have guessed there was something hidden there, except for anyone who's ever read a manhwa. The scroll spoke of a man named Liu Jinshan, a legendary martial master of the Liu family, once known as the Spear Demon. He wanted to mirror him his entire life, never knowing the meaning of defeat. The only ones who rivaled him were the Blade King and the Sword Emperor. At least, that's what he thought, until the moment he was about to die from a severe wound caused by someone's betrayal. The attackers came from Tianzhu, in the western regions, and called themselves the Great Celestial Cult. Even combining forces with the other 2 masters, they left unscathed. Knowing the full extent of their power, Liu Jinshan feared dying and leaving the world at the mercy of these unknown cultists. Reading this, the old man thought he'd heard that Tianzhu was a lawless land, much like Mirim. But to be so powerful as to leave his ancestor in ruins? Thinking further, he recalled that the Empress had mentioned something similar. She was heading west to learn about her parents. That was why she performed the retirement ritual, to leave without fear of not being able to return. This made the old man wonder about that place. After a deadly battle against those men, the spear demon gained enlightenment and completed the Annihilating Wind Spear technique. However, since those men continued to keep him under control, he needed to pass this technique to his successors to use during a major crisis. This was why the heir reading the scroll would have its guidance to ensure the survival of the Liu family. Letting out a small laugh, he spoke to his ancestor, saying that their family truly was in a great crisis at that moment. Then he began wondering what to do, as he was too old to learn a new martial art. He could now only use one arm and was no longer capable of properly wielding a spear. Seol approached, calling for her grandfather. He placed a hand on her shoulder and turned to see her. She came running at full speed, having woken up very early, shouting that she was starving. She ran at an incredible speed, still carrying the bamboo staff he had made for her to train spear techniques. She really loved that bamboo. At that moment, the old man realized what was happening. Now he knew. The last secret manual left by his ancestor for their family had been made precisely for Seol. He picked her up in his arms and asked if she wanted some meat, to which she enthusiastically shouted yes. The scene shifted to show an empty bowl and the sound of a burp. With her stomach full, Seol wore a sleepy expression, making the old man chuckle. But before she could get the chance to sleep, he asked if she wanted to play with him to help digest the food. Excited, Seol immediately agreed. He handed her the bamboo staff and told her to follow him. She was a little confused at first. The old man was doing this because he planned to train her seriously from now on, thinking he would need to be strict with her. One day, she would finally understand that it was all for her safety. Outside, she called for her grandfather to come out of the house. He asked if she had been watching him train with his spear all this time, and she nodded affirmatively. Holding a small twig in his hand, he asked her to try to imitate him. He would use only that twig to defend himself against her. In the next instant, Seol swung the bamboo staff with impressive strength, leaving the old man momentarily confused. But she didn't give him much time to think, as she was already charging up another critical strike aimed straight at his face. He shouted that he wasn't ready yet, but used his chi to strengthen the twig and block the blow. Impressed, he thought that even though he had used strengthening techniques, his hands still felt like they had taken some damage. Once again, Seol launched into the attack, unleashing a flurry of strikes while the old man defended himself as best he could. He shouted for her to slow down, and she smiled, saying she would. But instead, she started attacking even faster. Desperate, the old man yelled, asking if she wanted so badly to beat him in a fight, but she only shouted back that she was just having fun. With a leap, she soared high into the air, and the old man jumped to catch her midair. He managed to grab her foot, but at that exact moment, She used Jianshan's hand as leverage and propelled herself even higher, startling him with her precision and technique. It was none other than Wudang's sex cloud step technique, executed flawlessly by Seol. Her talent was dazzling. She was truly a genius of the family. Landing gracefully on the rooftop of the house, the old man shouted, asking if she was just playing with him, and declared he would teach her a lesson that day. With speed matching hers, he appeared behind her, surprising Seol. But just as he reached out to grab her, saying he had caught her, his arms went right through her. It was a residual image of the girl. She was already behind him. The two engaged in an intense chase, but Seol was having too much fun, taunting him to catch her if he could. We then see the old man lying on the ground, as Seol approached, declaring she had won. All he could manage to say was that he was so tired he was going to die. Then he told Seol she'd have to live alone from now on. She paused, looking at him, and the old man passed out. Seol called for her grandfather, but he didn't respond. She began slapping his face hard, to the point where his nose started bleeding, but he still didn't move or wake up. Her nose began to bleed as well, and panic overtook Seol entirely. She started screaming for her grandfather not to die. It was all just an act by the old man, a way to rein her in, as he knew he wouldn't be able to control her for much longer, and if she couldn't control her powers, she might end up hurting herself. He needed to help her use them in the best way possible. Pretending to be in pain, Jianshan called out to Seol, who was still in a panic. He told her that if she started obeying him, he might not die. He asked if she would listen to him from now on, and she said yes. The old man then sprang to his feet, fully animated, saying he had come back to life, and Seol celebrated, overjoyed. Poor girl didn't understand what had just happened. From that day on, they began playing various games, and every day they trained. Seasons passed, and now it was autumn. Seol's talent continued to shine brighter and brighter. Perhaps there had never been a child like her in all of Nirim's history. She was like a chosen one, destined for greatness. That was the only way to describe someone like her. Thanks to her immortal body, her internal chi flow had no obstructions. She was a superhuman who had already achieved the unrestricted domain, something most martial arts masters could only dream of attaining. And since beginning her training, she had been able to learn martial arts as effortlessly as a duck learns to swim. The girl's learning progress was simply unbelievable. A stone trembled after a strike, and then Jianshan praised her strength for making such a large rock shake with her blow. He asked if she wanted to eat, and she began saying she wanted meat as they started heading home. A noise caught the old man's attention, and when he looked back, a piece of the rock Seol had struck cracked and broke off, tumbling down. Had she really done that at her age? The rock fell, and someone screamed. It seemed they were about to be hit by the stone, and the old man saw this. Thinking it was too late, something shot past the rock with incredible speed, causing it to stop midair before returning to the top of the hill. Looking at Seol, Jianshan was stunned. She was controlling the rock from a distance using telekinesis. Was there anything this child couldn't do? When had she learned to do that? Seol greeted Hyunhee, and the old man finally realized it was her who had been saved by the little girl. Approaching, Hyun asked what had happened to cause such a commotion. She had nearly been crushed into a pile of meat. She was carrying supplies. Inside their house, Hyunhee asked how his arm was. The old man replied that the pain had subsided, but, unless he underwent body reconstruction, he wouldn't fully heal from the wound. Changing the subject, he asked about the investigation. She said she had documented all the forces within a 50-kilometer radius. The notebook included details about children who acted as their spies. The old man was impressed by the level of detail and organization in the notebook, though it was disheartening to see so many corrupt individuals listed. She explained that she had ranked the targets by power level in the notebook, so they should consider attacking only those on the first few pages. But ignoring her suggestion, the old man flipped straight to the back of the notebook, making her nervous as she thought he wanted to face the strongest enemies. One of the entries described the Celestial Dragon Merchant Association, a group of bastards who exploited commoners through loan sharking and human trafficking. He asked how they could do such things to people. Hyunhee explained that, in addition to bribing the authorities, they had the backing of the Orthodox sects, granting them absolute authority in the region. She was about to suggest choosing another target instead, but the old man decided that they would rob those very bastards. Hyunhee didn't seem thrilled with the idea, or perhaps she was suddenly constipated. The scene shifts to Shounen County. The atmosphere there was heavy, and a fly was trying to enter a building. Someone swung a broom to swat the insect, and the person holding it told their father to stop. Even the shop across from theirs had already closed. The old man said he wouldn't give up and hand over the inn to them, but the young man explained that doing so would only increase their debt. Life was tough for them, as the same people who demanded payments also prevented customers from visiting their business. Taking the broom from his son's hands, the old man was ready to go out and confront those bastards, but the young man stopped him, saying that if he tried that, they'd both end up dead. The door to the establishment suddenly burst open, startling both father and son, who immediately stopped arguing. Jinshan entered with Seol by his side, both of them apparently in disguise, with his spear strapped to his back. He asked if the inn was open. Sitting at a table inside, the innkeeper asked how he had managed to get there. The old man replied that he had walked and asked why. The innkeeper then asked if no one had tried to stop them at the door. Jinshan said that there had been people, but they seemed tired, so he put them to sleep for a while. The innkeeper grew nervous, but Jinshan asked if they were accepting orders. The old man said yes and asked what he'd like to order. Seol shouted that she wanted meat, and Jinshan ordered chicken porridge. The innkeeper said he'd prepare it immediately. Several dishes were soon brought to the table, and Jinshan noted he hadn't ordered all that food. The innkeeper explained that he didn't need to pay and should enjoy the meal. Emotional, the innkeeper said it had been a long time since they had customers, so he was grateful Jinshan could taste his food. Jinshan was already aware of the situation. The town was under the control of the Merchant Association, and everyone seemed to be struggling immensely. Suddenly, a chair was thrown to the floor and shattered. A man entered, demanding to know who had given the innkeeper permission to serve customers and who had dared to attack the men guarding the door. Politely, the innkeeper approached to ask what he meant, but the thug interrupted him by kicking his shin. Jinshan continued eating and remarked that he could hear a rabid dog barking nearby. The innkeeper leaned closer and warned Jinshan to be careful. The man who had entered was a first-class martial artist known as Plum Blossom and was dangerous. Picking up a plate, the thug mocked the rabid dog comment, then hurled the plate at the protagonist, saying the crazy one here was the old man. The plate was thrown with force, but it stopped mid-air, leaving Plum Blossom confused. Even Jinshan was momentarily surprised to see this, but he quickly realized it was Seol's telekinesis at work. Still eating, Seol remarked that it would be a waste if the plate broke, and the old man gave a smug smile. Looking back at the martial artist, he stood up, cleared his throat, and startled the man, who began wondering who this monstrous individual was. Could he be from the fallen demon cult? The man immediately dropped to his knees before the old man, begging for forgiveness and mercy. The old man then asked if he realized he was in the wrong, but also told him he needed to learn to show respect to his elders. Placing his fingers on the man's chin, who looked confused, Jinshan began slapping him repeatedly. The man cried out, pleading for his life, saying he would even leave Murim forever if he could just stay alive. The old man shouted that if he ever saw that kid's face again, he would beg to be eliminated for good. Bleeding, the martial artist, who was of first-class rank, was left lying on the ground, completely defeated and humiliated. For some reason, this made Jinshan think about the mountain bandits, and wonder if they were doing well. Once again, cries for mercy could be heard, this time from another part of the city. Someone was being dragged by their hair while a crowd gathered nearby. The person couldn't pay off their debt, and someone suggested trying to stop the two debt collectors, but it wasn't a good idea to target the Celestial Dragon Merchant Association. Someone approached the two who were dragging the person by their hair, shouting for them to release his daughter. He held a bone in his hand as a weapon, but he was struck hard in the face by one of the men, the bald one, using only the sheath of his sword. The bald man called him a crazy old fool and said his actions had only hastened his death. The other said he was old enough to kick the bucket anyway. The people gathered around were disgusted by the scene, wondering why no one had the courage to get rid of those scumbags. Someone else pointed out that opposing the Merchant Association would bring trouble, but then they noticed some people approaching. A voice shouted, calling one of the merchant men trash, and he turned around, demanding to know who the coward was that dared say such a thing. It was Hyun-hee, accompanied by Sang-gu and the bald bandit, disguised as Wudang's sect Taoists. Startled, he hesitated, wondering what the Wudang sect was doing there. But without giving him much time to think, Hyun ordered him to release the girl immediately. The man started to justify himself, saying he was only collecting a debt, and told them to leave while still pulling the girl by her hair. Hyun-hee asked if he wasn't, in fact, kidnapping the girl, but with a mocking expression, he asked if she thought they feared the Wudang sect. He was about to say they also had someone who could fight against them, but with just one sword movement, the man had already lost his hand. The girl began to fall, and the man didn't immediately realize he had become a discount Jaime Lannister. Holding his severed hand in shock, he began screaming, and the bald villain demanded to know what they were doing as he drew his sword. Hyun-hee walked toward them, saying she had warned them to release the girl and that she would cut off his hand if they didn't. Someone placed a hand on her shoulder, saying it was enough. It was Pung-ho, warning that if those two didn't leave immediately, the next thing to leave their bodies would be their heads. Terrified, the debt collectors fled, and the crowd began shouting insults at them as they left. The girl stood next to her father. The redhead asked Hyun-hee where they would go next, and she said there was another place where those bastards were extorting common folk. We see a port with several fishing boats docked. The association had been charging excessive fees at the port to all incoming boats. They claimed the fees were for loading and unloading goods, but in reality they did nothing. Since part of the money was bribes, officials didn't touch these guys. The place had become a safe haven for those scoundrels. At the port, they began taking down several men from the association, and the boatmen expressed their gratitude. Only after a good beating would those celestial dragon associates learn their lesson. Before one man could finish his sentence, another slapped his mouth, telling him to watch what he said because someone was approaching. He remarked that the other place was where a significant amount of money circulated. It was one of the 9 great sects, a pillar of the Murim alliance, the Manhua sect. The men of the Manhua sect arrived at the port, declaring that the area was under their jurisdiction, as well as that of the Celestial Dragon Merchant Association. After making this statement, one of them clenched his teeth in anger and asked what he and the others were doing there, identifying them as being from the Wudang sect. Peng Ho turned to them, and the scene shifted back to a memory. In the flashback, he explained how they should act once disguised as Wudang sect cultists. The problem, however, was that her teachings seemed to have been completely ignored, as the group immediately reverted to acting like savages. Then, in the present, the red-haired man suddenly adopted a serious posture, accusing the Manhua warriors of being conspirators and thieves. A few days earlier, back at the bandits' hideout, Peng Ho had explained who the martial artists of the Merchant Association were. The manager, Yang Chung, was stronger than a mid-level martial arts master, and beneath him were 4 first-class martial artists known as the Gentlemen. Jinshan scoffed at the absurdity of scum like them having the audacity to call themselves gentlemen, but Peng Ho added there was more. Their leader was none other than a secondary disciple of the Manhua sect. He explained that keeping a sect running required a lot of money. It was understandable that they accepted such trash as disciples as long as they paid well. Slamming his hand on the table, Peng Ho was outraged at the corruption from those who constantly preached about justice and morality. The old man, however, said that this was even better. Confused, Peng Ho asked why, and the old man explained that with key figures of the Murim Alliance involved, this was the perfect opportunity to strike back. Just hearing the name Murim Alliance irritated Jinshan, so there was no point in thinking further. It didn't matter who was in charge, whether it was a sect, the association, or the Murim Alliance, they would fight them with full force. Nervously, he pointed to herself, asking if he meant she would have to fight too. Jinshan didn't answer directly. Instead, he said it was time to start writing a letter. Back at the port, someone shouted for everyone to stop. The Manhua warrior reiterated that the jurisdiction was shared between their sect and the Merchant Association. He was furious to see Wudang sect disciples in their territory. The bandits, disguised as Wudang Taoists, calmly replied that they were there to beat up scum. They mockingly asked if the Manhua sect was conspiring with those extortionists, sarcastically referring to the Manhua warriors as grandiose. Sanggu called it a disgrace to the Murim Alliance, saying that behavior like theirs brought shame to Taoists everywhere. The bald man merely nodded in agreement. Irritated, the Manhua Taoist asked if they were prepared to face the consequences of provoking them openly. The red-haired man turned to the crowd and shouted, asking if anything he had said was wrong. Some people quietly agreed, while others urged everyone to stay silent to avoid trouble with the Merchant Association. Then, a voice in the crowd shouted that the red-haired man was absolutely right. Those supporting criminals were as bad as the criminals themselves. The one shouting was Jinshan, wearing a straw hat as a disguise. He continued calling them no better than crows feasting on corpses. This incitement from the old man stirred the crowd, making them agree with him and intimidating the Manhua Taoists. The crowd was in an uproar. One of the disciples began drawing his sword, but he noticed and rushed toward him, shouting that she saw him preparing to fight. With a swift move, she struck his wrist with her scabbard, making him cry out in pain. He tried to explain, saying the movement had been unconscious, but he ignored him and yelled that they were trying to attack. Meanwhile, Peng Ho kicked another Taoist, demanding how scum like them dared to provoke them. The bald man also charged into the fray. Apparently, the Manhua Taoists weren't very strong, as they became desperate and fearful under attack. Shocked, the crowd murmured about how excessive the Taoists' actions seemed, while others said they had expected better decorum from them. The old man shouted that it didn't matter. What mattered was beating up the bad guys, and the people began to agree, albeit cautiously. As the Manhua Taoists lay sprawled on the ground like discarded trash, someone asked if they had regained their senses. The red-haired man remarked that he thought they probably had. The redhead said that, in any case, if the Hua sect protected that scum again, the same thing would happen to them. As they walked away, someone mentioned they were hungry and suggested finding something delicious to eat, leaving the Taoists of Manhua behind. The first men who had been beaten by the bandits woke up and went toward the one still unconscious, asking if the young master was all right. But when they reached him to try and help, they saw he had already stood up, emanating a dark chi. declaring he would definitely make them pay with their lives for the humiliation they made him endure that day. His hatred for the Wudang sect was palpable. It was still afternoon, and we see another building in the county, where the bandits were staying. Now in his normal clothes, Sang-gu remarked that he felt much better without wearing those stifling robes, and Jinshan said that if they were already changed, it was time to move, to which all three agreed. Sitting at a table drinking tea, Hyun-hee asked him when those bastards would make their move, and he replied that it wouldn't take long since they were likely burning with the desire for revenge. Night had fallen, and Seol was sleeping peacefully, when we saw several Taoists from the Hua sect approaching the building where they were staying. Jinshan and Hyun-hee were still awake, and the old man commented on how quickly they had responded. The girl noted that they were probably very angry. One of the disciples who had been beaten earlier asked the innkeeper if he was sure they were there, and the man replied that he wouldn't lie. Shouting, the disciple ordered them to enter and find their targets, declaring he would beat them to death, but he didn't want to act without informing the master first. Grabbing the boy by the neck, the young master asked if his words were a joke to him and declared he would take full responsibility for what happened there. Watching from a distance, Jinshan observed that all these orthodox sect brats lacked patience and got angry too easily. Now was the time to exercise caution. Hyun-hee bowed to the old man and agreed with him. One of the Taoists slammed the door open, shouting for permission to enter. Jinshan asked the meaning of such rudeness, explaining that his child was still asleep, forcing the man to apologize. They began checking all the available rooms but couldn't find who they were looking for. Furious, the Taoist who had been beaten earlier confronted the innkeeper, who begged for his life. While the man shouted outside, Jinshan thought about the sword Empress. She had turned the Murim alliance upside down. Even though months had passed, he was still a wanted man. He marveled at not being recognized yet but was also grateful. Seol was still sleeping soundly, and the old man murmured to her, even as she slept, that all of this would soon be over. In Jiangxiang village, someone asked if that was the place. Several Taoists from the Wudang sect were gathered there, and one said the letter instructed them to meet there. Could something have happened again? Someone suddenly appeared behind them, and as they turned to look, Hyun-hee emerged from a corner, appearing injured and exhausted, addressing her martial uncles. They rushed to help her, asking why she hadn't mentioned being in trouble instead of sending such a mysterious letter. Where were the others? Hadn't she seen Jong-hyun? Hyun-hee explained that she couldn't include everything in a letter, as it had to be sent urgently, but everyone was dead. The Wudang Taoists were shocked to hear this. She continued, saying that being the only survivor was so humiliating that she could barely endure it. A low chuckle was heard, followed by someone asking if that was really the truth. Hyun-hee froze in place, and a man with white and black hair stepped closer to them. It was Elder Myuhyo, who had come in person to see her. Still paralyzed with fear, Hyun-hee wondered if she could deceive such a man. Emanating his chi, Myuhyo spoke, questioning how all her companions had been killed, yet a female disciple managed to survive. If she was telling the truth, she should reveal who dared harm the great disciples of the Wudang sect. He demanded answers immediately, warning her she couldn't lie in his presence. His threatening aura was terrifying. Trembling, Hyun-hee recounted that they had been recovering in Shangyang County after subduing the bandits when they were attacked by the Merchant Association. Those who harbored grudges against them launched a surprise attack during the night. She was the only one who managed to survive, but even so, she barely escaped after being held captive for so long. Myuhyo then asked why she chose to send a letter instead of returning to the sect herself. She explained that as soon as they realized she had escaped, they began monitoring the entrance to the village. The elder asked if that was true and confirmed that those bastards truly had control over the village. He had one last question. Was it only the Merchant Association that attacked them? Could the disciples of the Wudang sect really have lost to third-rate rats? One of the 4 chivalrous swords of the Wudang sect had also left from there. Crying, Hyun-hee was about to explain, but the elder, full of rage, demanded that she answer him immediately. On the ground, in front of all those men, Hyun-hee began to speak. She revealed the truth. The Celestial Dragon Merchant Association was being supported by the Manhua sect. This revelation shocked the elder, but one of the men present confirmed her statement. The Merchant Association was indeed a primary financier of the Manhua sect. The elder asked Hyun-hee once again, was she really attacked by the Manhua sect? She shouted that she would never dare to lie to him. Turning his back on her, Myuhyo ordered everyone to follow him. They were heading to Shangyang County. Back near the county, the Taoists of the Manhua sect were still searching for the supposed Taoists from the Wudang sect who had attacked them. From the forest, the real Taoists of the Wudang sect observed the Manhua Taoists, confirming the information Hyun-hee had given them. Hyun-hee had moved away from the men with her and, from the middle of the forest, began waving to the Manhua men. One of them spotted her and shouted that she was the girl from the Wudang sect, charging toward her. They intended to capture her and take her to Manhua, but before they could attack, the Wudang sect had already acted. Myuhyo, emanating rage to the point of radiating energy from his eyes, shouted that they dared to insult the name of the Wudang sect. They would pay with their lives. One of his disciples asked for orders, and the elder said they only needed one person to talk, the rest could be sent to their graves. Confirming the command, one Taoist immediately sliced another in half, and the massacre began. The Manhua men cried for help, but in that place and at that moment, no one could hear them. Finally, only one was left alive, kneeling before one of the disciples. Murd3red approached him and said that if he answered his questions obediently, he could live. The man confirmed he would. The elder asked if there were other members of the Manhua sect in the village. The man replied that there were. A subordinate of the elder remarked that everything he had said was proving to be true. The elder ordered the remaining man to summon the Taoists to where they were. The man was initially confused, so the elder shouted, demanding that he call the bastards from the Manhua sect to that location. Running, the man yelled that he would do it. He passed by Jinshan, who was in disguise, and it finally became clear, those men weren't Taoists at all but members of the Merchant Association. Jinshan and Seol watched the man pass. Shortly after, the Taoists of the Manhua sect were seen crossing the city's bridge, heading out. There were 5 of them, but judging by their expressions, it was clear there would be double that number by the end of the fight, though not in their favor. The leader of the Manhua Taoists recognized Murd3red from the Wudang sect and asked if he had summoned them. One of the elder's disciples grew irritated at the casual way the Taoist addressed the elder, but Murd3red didn't seem to care much. Annoyed, the one wearing a bandana over his eye said that, even with someone as powerful as Murd3red there, they couldn't take much more. The elder insulted the man, saying he had tried to show mercy by hearing their side, but they dared to act so boldly before him. The Taoist told the elder to stop insulting them, or else. He didn't even have time to finish his sentence before being slapped across the face, jolting him awake. The force of the blow was immense, yet he managed to remain standing, which impressed the elder. The elder prepared to strike again, but the man managed to block the blow. Even so, he lacked the strength to hold back the elder's arm entirely, which was pressed against his head. This enraged Murd3red further, prompting everyone to draw their swords. With anger and emanating dark chi, the elder declared he would not repeat himself. If the man didn't release his hand immediately, everyone there would be dead in an instant. This terrified the Taoist. He kept holding the elder's hand, but in the next moment, he relented and let go. Turning his back, the elder ordered his subordinates to leave, while the Wudang disciple called him an arrogant bastard. The disciple asked the elder if they were really going to let him leave after such insolence, but Murd3red said it was better to let him go. Tomorrow, he would visit Manhua to meet their sect master personally. The Hua sect member was so furious he smashed a bottle of liquor on the table. He shouted that no one in the Hua sect was weak. One of his subordinates complained that everyone had been underestimating the Hua sect since the last tournament. If that elder hadn't shown up, it would have been a different story. The leader wanted to report the matter to the elders of the Hua sect, but they had come there without informing them, and it would be difficult to explain the truth. Should they leave things as they were? The leader shouted that enough was enough, declaring they didn't need to leave things unresolved. Several men from the Merchant Association stood beside him. He had gathered everyone there, impressing his juniors. Their livelihoods were at risk, so they were willing to do whatever it took to protect it. Even if the enemy had an elder on their side, there was no way they could handle hundreds of martial artists. This excited the leader, and he licked his lips. Tonight would be their enemy's last night on Earth. Jinshan watched the situation unfold from a rooftop. He approached him from behind, and he asked if all the members of the Wudang sect were sleeping at the inn. She confirmed they were, and everything was going according to plan. However, she added that Elder Murd3red had declared he would visit the Hua sect the next day to speak directly with their sect master. If that happened, they would be exposed. Jinshan remarked that this village was famous for a dish called sweet and sour pork and asked if he had ever tried it. She recognized the dish, and they started discussing its preparation, noting how the meat was coated in oil before frying, creating intense flames during cooking. They had already added plenty of oil to the two sects, so there was no chance they would wait until the next day to attack. Noticing the Taoists from the Hua sect approaching the building, he called his attention to them. The oil fire would burn that night. A large number of martial artists were heading toward the battle site, resembling an army marching to war. The bastard known as the first brother among the others would serve as the kindling for this fire. Shouting, he declared that tonight they would deliver punishment to the bastards who dared underestimate the Hua sect and make them pay for everything. The mini-army began invading the building, and Jinshan added that, just like the first brother, the Wudang sect elder would also serve as fuel for this fire. Murd3red was awake, watching the invasion unfold. Realizing they had no choice but to fight, he grew excited at the prospect of massacring them all. Jinshan and he retreated from the scene of the impending battle, and she asked the old man who he thought would win the fight. He replied that it didn't matter. These people had caused the destruction of his family. What truly mattered was emptying that massive merchant association mansion, which had been built by exploiting the blood and tears of countless common folk. From that moment forward, in the name of the Black Mountain Outlaws, they would rob that palace until there was nothing of value left. Jinshan explained that they had exactly 15 minutes. If word reached the inn where the battle was happening that the Merchant Association's headquarters had been targeted, the deception would be exposed. Hyunhee mentioned they couldn't leave Seol alone, asking Jinshan to stay behind. He asked if they would be okay, and Pengho assured him they would rob the place quickly and didn't want the old man involved in such actions. Jinshan stressed that, no matter what happened, they had to leave after 15 minutes. They confirmed their understanding, and Pengho asked everyone if they understood the protagonist's instructions. They were not to fight those who didn't resist and had to handle the situation as swiftly as possible. The group headed to the mansion, leaving Jinshan and Seol behind. Looking at the way they moved, the old man noticed they had not neglected the training they received, so he thought there was no need to worry. The mansion was indeed empty, and Jinshan realized that 15 minutes had already passed. He began to worry that the bandits hadn't returned yet. Even if a few guards had stayed behind, they shouldn't have been a match for Pengho and Hyunhee. Grabbing his spear, he suddenly heard Seol say that the older sister was hurt. He asked her what she said, and the little girl repeated it. She had just woken up and said someone had struck Hyunhee. Now on high alert, the old man looked toward the mansion. He told Seol that he would return soon, instructing her not to go anywhere and to wait for him there. He asked if she understood, and still half asleep, she said she did. A sword flew through the air, and then it hit the ground. Hyunhee was disarmed and appeared to be severely injured. A massive man called them thieves and asked how they dared crawl into his territory to steal. He told them to prepare to leave behind both the property of the association and their lives. This was Yang Chong, a peak martial master of the association. Unprepared to face someone so strong, Pengho started to think they had made a big mistake. But in the next moment, Yang Chong lunged forward, shouting for them to drop the spoils they were carrying. He was incredibly fast, and his sword was already descending toward the red-haired man, who couldn't dodge in time. A flash of light appeared from the side, and when Yang Chong looked over, he saw the old man's spear flying at full speed, exploding near him and pushing him back. Despite being hit, Yang Chong landed on his feet, and everyone there was overjoyed to see the old man. They knew they would be saved. Hyunhee realized that in terms of inner chi, the old man had far more than that terrifying guard, but it wouldn't be an easy fight. Using the wall as a springboard, Yang Chong leapt forward, yelling at the old man, asking why a retired warrior like him was even there. The old man ordered the others to flee while he dealt with the guard, and though reluctant, they obeyed, escaping with all the stolen goods. Yang Chong wouldn't let them get away, so he prepared another leap to strike them down. But the old man intercepted him and asked where he thought he was going. The sword and spear collided, producing a shower of sparks, and the old man told him to try eliminating him first before chasing the bandits. Only then would he be able to go after them. Jumping back, Yang Chong realized the old man was no ordinary foe. He was a martial master, but why was someone like him associating with mere bandits? It didn't matter, he was still just a retired old man. Yang Chong charged again, delivering a flurry of strikes that the old man blocked. Hyunhee was shocked by the intensity of the battle. Even though Yang Chong was a level below the old man, the latter was fighting with only one arm. Chong noticed this and saw it as an opportunity. With a feint, he pretended to aim for the old man's head, but at the last moment, changed trajectory to strike his injured arm. Jinshan saw through the move and dodged the attack, which frustrated Yang Chong but also made him more excited. Laughing loudly, he tried provoking the old man, calling him a retired old cripple with a broken arm, saying he was just a body barely moving. Hyunhee noticed that Yang Chong kept targeting the old man's weakness and thought she needed to help, but the bandits called out to her at that moment. Pengho was on the roof, urging her to come with them, but she was still hesitant. The red-haired man shouted that she was too injured. He would help the old man, so she needed to flee immediately. He extended his arm to her, and she grabbed it, asking him to take care of the old man. She instructed him to launch a surprise attack that wouldn't hinder Jianshan's movements, and he assured her he would handle it. He was ready to risk his life to get Jianshan out of there. It was the least he could do after all the old man had done for him. The fight between the two men was intense, and this time, the old man was losing to Yang Chong. Chong taunted him, saying that since the old man's death anniversary was approaching, he shouldn't hold any grudges. His aura was immense. Jianshan knew his weakness was exposed, and the longer the fight dragged on, the greater his disadvantage would become. He had no choice but to end this using his final move. He was already prepared to lose his other arm. At that moment, something caught his attention, and Yang Chong seized the opportunity to attack, asking where the old man was looking. The elder shouted at him not to come closer, but it was Pengho approaching with a sword in his hand. The guard didn't care much about him. Even if he joined the fight, he would only be a mere obstacle to his ultimate goal. But in reality, it was Seol who was approaching, and the old man yelled for her to stay away. She was running alongside Peng Ho but seemed unnoticed by him. The fear of losing her grandfather was clear on her face, and she showed no fear in running to defend him. Yang Chong noticed the child running into the battle and was stunned to see someone so young moving with such speed. Seol called out to her grandfather and used the space distortion technique. Jianshin yelled that it was dangerous and asked Peng Ho to catch her. Peng Ho shouted that he would, but in the next moment, he stumbled and fell to the ground. Seol had dodged him and was already running toward her grandfather. Chong thought to himself that he didn't understand what was happening, but if he could capture the child as a hostage, he could negotiate the return of the stolen gold. He reached out to grab the girl, but in the next moment, she evaded him, jumping over his shoulder. The man froze at the sight, but he reacted quickly, managing to grab Seol by her clothes. Jianshin screamed her name, but Yang Chong declared that if he moved, the child would die. Little did he know. Placing the blade against her neck, he threatened to cut it unless the stolen gold was returned. The three froze in place as the guard shouted for the gold. Peng Ho yelled that he would bring it but pleaded for him to lower his sword. Seol, tearful, tried to break free from his grasp. She was nearly succeeding, forcing him to use his internal chi to keep her restrained. She struggled even more, moving vigorously to escape the brute's arms. Jianshin was desperate, fearing he would lose his granddaughter. Yang Chong shouted once again that if he moved, the child would die. He yelled that he didn't care whether it was her or the old man who perished, either should move. But Seol raised her small arm and shouted that she didn't want to be held. She was crying desperate, and gave a small slap to the brute's forearm. I wish I had forearms that size, but mine are thinner than my shins. The slap reverberated through Yang Chang's body, causing an air explosion around him. Seol fell to the ground, as he had involuntarily released her. In the next moment, his arm began to explode and twist internally, causing him to scream in pain and despair. He was still alive but utterly incapacitated, unable to comprehend what had just happened. The bones in his arm were completely shattered and reversed. He hadn't even been able to protect himself with internal chi. To think he had been injured by a mere baby. Before his injuries worsened further, he approached her, who was still lying on the ground, determined to eliminate the child at any cost. He raised his sword, screaming for Seol to die, but at that moment, someone grabbed his hair. When he looked up to see who had done it, it was the old man, bloodshot eyes filled with complete rage, calling him a bastard for daring to point a blade at his beloved granddaughter. Jianshin used all his strength to strike Yang Chong on the head with his lance. Wait, is the lance longer again? Is it Goku's staff? With a leap, the brute managed to dodge the old man's strike, declaring he wouldn't be defeated by such a slow attack. One arm was enough for him to deal with an old piece of trash like Jianshin. Wielding his sword, he descended from his leap, but the old man simply held his lance with 2 fingers, and used the third movement of the Liu family's lance technique, the Flying Executioner's Lance. The weapon pierced Yang Chong directly, causing him to drop his sword and fall. Screaming in agony, he finally hit the ground, writhing in pain. Jianshin asked if it hurt. Noting that all his bones were crushed and his internal organs were burning, he wagered it hurt quite a lot. He starts pleading with the old man to finish him off after falling into his trap, but Jianshin solemnly says he refuses. He tells him to use this time of suffering to reflect on the victims of his own greed. In any case, he doesn't need to feel ashamed of this defeat since his opponent was someone destined to be supreme. Jianshin runs through the night with Seol in his arms. She was sobbing uncontrollably, and the old man asks why she's crying. She responds that she's scared, but he tells her not to worry because he'll always protect her. Reflecting on what had happened, it seemed like a random move, but she had used a destructive palm technique from the Liu family on Yang Chang's arm. Thinking about how she was already capable of using the family's martial techniques at such a young age left the old man even more impressed with his granddaughter's power and talent. He starts laughing as he makes his way home. But the story in the town wasn't over yet. Back at the village port, someone shouts to prepare to set sail immediately. It was the bandits who had managed to steal a boat to escape. Hyun-hee remarks that the old man was late, but Peng Ho assures her he'll show up. One of the bandits spots something and shouts for the leader to look too. Jianshin was approaching the boat quickly, but he was being chased by the remnants of the Mercantile Association. They shout that they'll help the old man, but the red-haired man tells them to wait. Jianshin nears the boat and yells for them to set sail immediately. Peng Ho shouts for the sails to be raised and the boat to move at full speed. One of the mercantile remnants asks about someone who was supposed to report the situation to the two sects, and another replies that he's already on his way back. The boat was leaving their range, and it looked like they might leave the old man behind. Jianshin had reached the end of the dock, and the men shouted that it was the end of the line for him. They had to capture the old man, so they ordered their archers to fire at him. A massive volley of arrows was fired in the old man's and Seol's direction. but he leapt from the pier toward the ship. The arrows only hit the spot where he no longer stood, and the men shouted that he was foolish to jump into the water, saying he'd become fish food. But in the next moment, something left them shocked. The old man's foot touched the water but didn't sink. He was using the water strider crossing technique. He shouted for them to keep firing and not let him escape, and the archers obeyed, quickly drawing their bows for another volley. Another wave of arrows was shot toward the two, and Seol watched everything from the old man's back. She reached out her arm to grab one of the arrows, but at that moment, Jinshan made a leap that took them out of the arrow's range and landed on the ship, leaving everyone stunned by the feat. Our video ends here. If you enjoyed it, please like and subscribe to the channel. Until next time, bye bye.